우리의 용감한 정찰병 금색이에 의해 위험에 처했던 줄다라미는 마침내 구원되었습니다. 이제 우리 주인공들은 꽃동산을 노리고 무서운 음모를 꾸미고 있는 쪽제비 대장님과 맞서 어떤 싸움을 벌이게 될까요? 그럼 그 이야기를 잘 들어주십시오.
야, 수직대가 포향을 몰라? 응? 빨리 저쪽으로!
실버당한가 연대장을 찾으라! 금세가 특별보좌관 금세가
대장 카카 두더지파 연대장.
응? 연대장 어떻게 된 일인가? 그러니 너를 납치해갔던 놈들이 꽃동산 정찰병이 아니라 비밀 자료와는 상관이 없는 놈들이란 말이지.
예, 그렇습니다.
애꾸의 죽음, 두더지퍼 연대장의 납치. 저 연대장이 가져온 필름토리 하나를 놓고 왜 이렇게 복잡할까? 혹시 이것이 꽃동산의 미끼라면? 새우섬, 그렇지. 거기엔 나의 위력한 예비무기가 있지. 그걸 쓰자면 기동하는 척하면서 꽃동산의 물기를 돌려세워야 한다. 빨리 기동을 하여 진지를 찾아라.
이것이 방울꽃 정찰조가 보내온 자료입니다. 이것을 보면 대장놈의 총 공격을 위한 무력배 지정령을 성품 모두 할 수 있습니다. 대장놈의 움직임이 총 공격으로 이어질 수 있으니 우리는 싸움 준비를 잘 갖춰야 합니다. 놈들의 무력 배치 상태를 낱낱이 알아내어 보고한 방울꽃 정찰조 동무들에게 꽃동산에 인사를 보내줍시다. 그게 좋겠습니다. 그러면 부상당한 그들에게 큰 힘이 될 겁니다.
나의 위력한 특수포탄을 꽃동산 코앞인 새우섬으로 날아가야 할 텐데 어떻게 하나? 응? 저 가물치처럼 해야 한다. 앞에다는 꽃송이를 청 내들고 그 무서운 특수포탄에 보자기를 척 씌워서 깜짝같이 날아가야 한다. 그런데 새우소물은 누굴 보낸다? 그렇지. 두더지포 연대장인가?
예, 그렇습니다.
이제 곧 연대를 비상 소집시켜 부둣가로 나오라.
예?
알았는가?
알겠습니다. 대장놈이 왜 갑자기 부둣가로 나오라고 할까? 연대 비상경보!
부둣가로?
이놈들이 왜 갑자기 부둣가로 나가는 거야?
빨리 금색에게 알려야 한다. 아니, 줄다람이가
연대에서 축하 전문을? 대장남이 두더지 보연대를 갑자기 부둣가로 불러냈다고? 물고기 한 마리 잡자고 바닷속을 헤맸다니.
아치, 고운 적점인지 하는 놈을 어디 가서 뒤졌나?
야, 꽃동산 정찰병들을 밝혀내지 못하고 무슨 수작질이야? 그걸 가지고도 밖에 나가겠다고?
때리긴 왜 때리는 거야?
지금 두더지 포연장이 연대를 데리고 부둣가로 가고 있다. 이번 기회에 그놈의 정체를 밝혀내야 우리가 대장 앞에 나설 수 있다. 빨리 부둣가로!
대장 카카, 연대는
됐어. 차에 있는 옷들을 부리우라. 어서 저 옷들로 갈아입도록 하라.
아니,
Morning, comrade.
나보러 가는 줄
How
알았는데.
goes it?
서우다니. 요즘 연대장이 공도 세우는데 연대를 다 데리고 경치 좋은 새우섬으로 휴양을 가도록 하라.
예? 휴양을요?
그래, 휴양을 말이다. 자, 어서.
이번 기회에 연장 놈의 정체를 밝아놓기만 하면 우리의 목적을 이루갈 수 있다. 망쳐. 너희들은 저 배에 올라 연장 놈의 행동을 하나도 빠짐없이 사진 찍으라.
알겠습니다.
Oh, nice. Gifted flower is always the best flower, isn't it? And with stuff you grow your own, sometimes coming pretty close
아주
second.
멋있어. 자, 그럼 배에 올라라. 연대장, 여객선에는 새우샘에 보내는 식료품들을 실었다. 그리고 꽃동산 앞에 가서 그놈들이 보란듯이 마음껏 놀아라. 에? 자, 그럼
카카, 떠나겠습니다.
이제 저 배만 무사히 도착하면 새우섬은 모든 준비를 다 갖추게 된다.
이 기회를 놓치면 안 된다. 빨리.
새우섬이라면 꽃동산 코앞인데 왜 갑자기 거기 휴양을 보낼까? 대장놈이 무슨 꿍꿍이를 하는 것이 분명하다. 정다운 꽃동산의 동무들아.
연대장님, 꽃동산 경비함선입니다. 어떻게?
야야, 나도 보고 있다.
Oh, nice. Very nice. Yeah, we're allowed to have 4 plants here.
뭐? 놈들이 휴양객 차림으로 오고 있다고? 대장놈이 졸개들에게 갑자기 철관모를 벗기고 야영모를 씌웠다. 여객선에 대한 특별 감시를 조직하시오.
알았습니다.
Of course, Canada doesn't try to pretend that each of its provinces is a separate country. So the federal law passes and then all the other provinces pretty much follow suit.
뭐야?
아니 글쎄 또 훔쳤습니다. 이놈은 먹을 것이라면 번기가 채치우는 특등도적 입죠.
연 대장님 훔치지 않으면야 생지가 안 했죠.
또 한 번 그랬다가는 없다. 썩 사라져.
예.
Word.
반갑소 육존대장.
아, 두더지포 연대장.
대장이 보내는 식료품도 함께 싣고 왔어.
아, 식료품을 보내는 건 우리가 맡겠으니 당신들은 푹 쉬시오.
적은 밤, 수박,
야,
수박을 저 차에 따로 실으라. 야야야, 조심히 다루라. 조금이라도 잘못하면 그 자리에서 총살이다.
특별주의 표식이 붙은 수박 상자? 망고놈이 저건 왜 따로 빼돌리는 걸까? 어떻게 알아본다?
너 수박이라는 걸 보고 봤어?
먹어보지 않고 달고 신나고 기가 막혀.
가만, 저놈이 특등 도적이라고 했지. 저놈을 이용하자. 야야! 저건 먹을 생각 많아. 저 수박은 특별히 쪽제비들을 위해 보낸 거란 말이야.
더러워서 쪽제비들만 입이야. 야야.
이게야 삐디 꼴려서. 이야, 수박이라는 걸 한 번 꼭 먹어야겠는데.
맞았어. 이러고 있다가 아무것도 먹어보지 못해. 야, 응?
이거 수박 냄새가 아니야. 나도 맡아보자. 이게 어디서 석영 듣지야 이거? 석영이 맞긴 맞아? 응? 응? 이 자식이 누굴 속이자 그래 이거? 이 자식이?
Welcome back, comrade.
석영 너로 달래기. 아이고 성공이다. 그렇지. 야야 비켜래. 마지막 상자요.
마지막이라고 그럴 수 없겠는데. 수박 상자가 하나 없어졌다.
야 비켜라. 야 도둑놈. 이거 놀아.
먼저 보는 게 임자지.
무슨 수박이 이렇게 꽉하네. 글쎄 말이야. 이거 수박이 맞긴 맞아?
수박탄?
수박을 훔친 놈들이 저기 있다. 에이? 이 자식들이 수박탄을 훔쳐?
진짜 수박인 줄 알고.
그러니 쪽제비 대장놈의 휴양러름이 저 수박탄을 새우 섬으로 실어오기 위한 위장 전술이었구나.
저놈의 뒤를 바싹 따라야 한다.
글쎄 대장! 그따위 수박 하나가 뭐길래 우리 대원 둘씩이나 죽이는가?
그따위 둘치 새끼도 말이가 뭐라고.
뭐야 들지? 이 연대장을 뭘로 보고 건방지게.
이야, 이건 어디 자든 번. 가만. 이놈이 작아도 만만치 않은데. 그 성미가 꽤 급하구만. 저놈도 대장이 믿고 보냈겠는데 새우손 비밀을 알려준다고 큰일 나겠나? 자, 봤소? 그 수박은 바로 이런 무서운 포탄이요. 그 수박 포탄은 이 새우섬 같은 건 순식간에 휙 없애치울 수 있어. 자, 이번엔 저쪽으로.
그러니 이 새우섬은 휴양서로 위장된 쪽제비 대장놈이 비밀 지하 잠수기지로구나.
이제 새우섬에서 우리는 꽃동산 참모부가 있는 앵두골과 그 주변 동산들을 타격하게 돼요. 이제 당신은 저 꽃동산이 아예 없어지게 되는 멋진 장면을 보게 될 거예요.
쪽제비 대장, 이 교활한 놈. 내놈의 운명한 옷 속에 그런 사나운 이빨이 숨겨져 있었구나. 이 목숨 바쳐서라도 발사기지가 어디 있는가를 꼭 알아내요 꽃동산에 보고해야 한다. 이것이 꽃동산 정찰병인 나의 임무다. 가만, 저 잠수함은 분명 발사기지로 갈 것이다. 거기로 가자면 잠수복이 있어야 할 텐데.
죽으려면 쪽제비 놈들아. 왜 자꾸 우리 생지름을 부려먹어야 이거.
Hey, Zoop.
이거.
이 자식 무슨 뒷소리야?
잘못했어.
쏙 떨어져!
예. 빨리.
I'm doing all right. How are you?
빨리. 예. 중간장님 안 계시다.
그러니 발사기지가 바로 새우섬 밑에 있었구나.
Can't choose where I'm born there, Zoop. I mean, if I could, sure, why not? Free education, free healthcare, free provided housing.
놈이 들어왔다. 잡으라.
I mean, in that instance, I would of course speak Korean, so yeah. Give me anywhere that gives you that sort of social wage.
수중탄을 쏘라.
그놈이 없어졌습니다. 응? 야, 저쪽으로.
줄다라마. 줄다라마, 이건 네가 제일 좋아하는 방울꽃이야. 난 언제나 꽃동산을 위해 피는 방울꽃이 될 테야.
금세가 이 방울꽃은 숨이지는 않이 있어도 놈들의 무서운 음모를 꽃동산에 알리련다.
정말 좋은 기회를 얻었는데요.
그러게 말이다. 조금만 더 빨리 뒤를 따라잡아도 되는 건데. 저기. 자, 여기 말이. 가만. 자.
저 경비정의 무전기를 이용하자.
야, 저놈이 배어른다. 빨리.
우와, 뭐야?
우나스, 나 방울꽃 대답하라. 우나스, 나 방울꽃 대답하라. 우나스, 나 방울꽃. 우나스.
오, 방울꽃의 긴급무전이라고?
나 오나스 대답하라.
몰라, 저 내놈이?
꽃동산 전잘 명령히 알아봤구만. 너의 고운 목소리를 좀 들어볼까?
우나스, 나 방울꽃.
야, 외계팔이 저놈을 묶어라. 대장한테 생체를 맞춰야겠다.
알겠어. 자, 손을 내놔.
방울꽃 대답하라. 오나수 방울꽃이 보관다. 놈들의 무서운 특수포탄이 앵두꺼를 비롯한 꽃동산의 주요 지점들을 겨냥하고 있다. 놈들의 무서운 특수포탄이 앵두꺼를 비롯한 꽃동산의 주요 지점들을 겨냥하고 있다. 꽃동산의 주요 지점들을 겨냥하고 있다. 발사기지의 위치는
방울꽃. 방울꽃은 지고 물망쳐가 핀다. 방울꽃 말아라.
서라! 서지 않으면 쏜다!
난 당신의 편이요. 빨리 오쇼. 아이고 이런. 꽃동산 정찰병을 잡았어. 빨리 오쇼.
우리 방울꽃 정찰자가 위험에 처한 것 같습니다. 빨리 출동하시오. 방울꽃이 피어있는 한 어떤 일이 있어도 이 정찰자리를 꽃동산에 알려야 한다.
사나운 가시덤불 속에 피어난 하얀 방울꽃 그 어디 있어도 내 고향 꽃향기 안고 피네 변함없이 사나운 빗바람 불어도 옥색이 피는 방울꽃 뿌리를 묻어준 내 고향 서슴이 안고 피네 변함없이
언제나 꽃동산을 위해 피는 방울꽃이 되세요.
There we go. Episode 17. Pretty damn good. Alright, we're gonna go on to our read here for this morning. Where I do. It's a place where a cat shouldn't be. The star of the show is the cat. Look at him. Everyone loves the cat. Come on now. Every place is a place a cat should be. Totally. That's hilarious. Okay, I also want to point out as well, if you comrades are on Twitter, do the bare minimum you can for a First Nation today, and maybe share any sort of, you don't even have to share any kind of post. Just make a post of any kind with the tag search the landfill if you can, please. You could even share this one and do it. Everyone was paying attention to the cat, it's true. Just when you do, if you do share it. Yeah, if you're on Blue Sky, shout it out too. Just needs the hashtag search the landfill, please. It means murdered and missing Indigenous women who were murdered by a serial killer were dumped in, police believe they were dumped into a particular landfill, and police and authorities refused to search the landfill for the bodies, citing all sorts of fucking bullshit. Because, I mean, it's a typical thing. They never want to give First Nations families closure because they're committing genocide against First Nations. Why the fuck would they want to give closure? And I noticed a bunch of settlers, Euros crying because of this. Yeah, police were probably involved. Is this because new events? No, this shit's been going on for hundreds of years. The genocide hasn't stopped.
Shoot to kill. Yamaza. Kill the poor. The farmer. Kill the poor. The farmer. Brr, pa. Pa. Brr, pa. Pa. Attention. Kichi, kichi. Kichi.
Yeah, the recent events I just said. First Nation women being dumped into a landfill. Police refusing to search the landfill for their bodies. That's the recent event. 3 Indigenous women were murdered by a serial killer. Police suspect that the serial killer dumped the bodies in the landfill. They refuse to search the landfill for the bodies so that their families can bury them. They searched a different landfill for the white woman who was a victim, but they refused to search this landfill for the First Nations victims who were. It's recent. I mean, murdered First Nations women refusing to be searched is always recent, though. That's kind of what it was saying. Even, there was one before this, probably not even a fucking year before this. It happens all the time. Why I say, like, the least thing a European can do, especially if you call yourself a communist, is, like, you know, share a tag today. Try and get police to search this fucking landfill so their families can actually get their daughters' bodies back. Bury them, have some kind of closure of some kind. So Benny Johnson here, crying. Of course they can find them, Zoop. They don't want to find them. That's the problem, right? They're First Nations women. Police never search for First Nations women. This is a common thing here. That's the point. That's what I'm trying to get across to you. It's literally a common fucking thing. It's why the whole MMIW, it's why that whole thing exists. Like, we can go murdered, missing, And you'll just see it fucking come up all over the place, bud. It's all the fucking time. Yeah, they found the white woman's body that was murdered and dumped in a separate landfill. But they, again, refused to search the landfill that these natives are in. I mean, we've even had celebrities like that fucking guy who plays the Hulk has even retweeted it. It's sad, but I mean, that's just a reality faced by native people all over Canada every single day. And then they wonder why, we don't trust fucking allies. Quote unquote allies. Yeah, what's his name? The guy that plays the Hulk? Can't think of his name now. Mark Ruffalo? I think it's Mark Ruffalo or something like that. He shared a post about it. Which is like millions of people looking, and yeah. Even then they still refuse to search it. It's bullshit. And like I say, it's something that happens probably every week in Canada. Alright, I'll continue my read here. Yeah, exactly, Sean. It's when it's not just a costume anymore. You know, then they're tired of it. Then they don't want nothing to do with it. The costume to be worn at a party, then they're all over it. Like I always say, this one quote, right? Funny how everybody likes the Indian that talks about the earth, the water, harmony, feathers, and spirit animals. And nobody likes the Indian that talks about the invasion, terrorism, murder, genocide, plundering, and rape by the settlers. They just ignore when you talk about that stuff. Michael Foucault. Humanity does not gradually progress from combat to combat until it arrives at universal reciprocity, where the rules of law finally replace warfare. Humanity installs each of its violence is in a system of rules and thus proceeds from domination to domination. And Frantz Fanon, for Hegel there is reciprocity. Here the master laughs at the consciousness of the slave. What he wants from the slave is not recognition, but work. This is chapter 1. My introductory chapter began by making two broad claims. First, I claim that since 1969, we have witnessed a modus operandi of colonial power relations in Canada shift from a more or less concealed structure of domination to a form of colonial governance that works through the medium of state recognition and accommodation. And second, I claim that regardless of this shift, Canadian settler colonialism remains structurally oriented around achieving the same power effect it sought in the pre-1969 period: the dispossession of indigenous peoples of their land and self-determining authority. This chapter further develops my first claim by providing a theoretical account of how the politics of recognition has come to serve the interests of colonial power in the ways that it has. It is to this question, I claim, that Fanon provides a strikingly perceptive answer. In situations where colonial rule does not depend solely on the exercise of state violence, its reproduction instead rests on the ability to entice indigenous peoples to identify, either implicitly or explicitly, with the profoundly asymmetrical and non-reciprocal forms of recognition, either imposed on or granted to them by the settler state of society. Fanon first developed this insight in his 1952 text, Black Skin, White Masks, where he persuasively challenges the applicability of Hegel's dialectic of recognition to colonial and racialized settings. In contradiction to what he viewed as Hegel's abstraction, Fanon argued that, in actual contexts of domination, such as colonialism, not only are terms of recognition usually determined by and in the interests of the master, colonizing state and society, but also over time slave populations, the colonized, tend to develop what he called psychoactive attachments to these master-sanctioned forms of recognition, and that this attachment is essential in maintaining the economic and political structure of master-slave / colonizer-colonized relations by themselves. By the end of this chapter, it should be clear in theoretical terms that the contemporary politics of recognition is ill-equipped to deal with the interrelated structural and psychoaffective dimensions of colonial power that Fanon implicated, and the persuasion of colonial hierarchies. Once his theoretical ground has been paved, I can then proceed to chapters 2, 3, and 4 to evaluate Fanon's critique against 3 empirical case studies drawn from the post-1969 period of Indigenous state relations in Canada. The US we assimilate through higher education. No unis on the res, gotta go off res. Yeah, it's the same thing. Basically, you're forced to go into the cities. And then you're encouraged, of course, to stay off of the res from then forward, right? If you want to have a good job, etc., like work in their society or whatever, you're encouraged to get your own apartment in the city, live like that. Yeah, fuck that. Fuck that altogether. This chapter is organized into 4 sections. In the first section, yours are encouraged to go back to the res and get on council. That's how liberal. Yeah, I mean, certain ones are encouraged to do that. If it seems like you'll be a good little comprador, you'll go back and sign. Yeah, like maybe you'll get elected to a leadership position on a band. Maybe you fucking have some influential elders or something like that. They want you to go back and have them participate in state meetings of reconciliation and sign over fucking land claims and everything else. We get that much. Also, this chapter is organized into 4 sections. In the first section, I outline some of the underlying assumptions that informs the politics of recognition, from Hegel's Master-Slave to the work of Charles Taylor. The second section, I apply the insights of Fanon's critique of Hegel's dialectic of recognition to highlight a number of problems that appear to plague Taylor's politics of recognition when applied to colonial contexts. Although I tend to focus most of my attention on Taylor's work, to be clear that the conclusions reached in this chapter are by no means limited to his contribution alone. In the third section, I hope to show that the process of colonial subjugation identified in the previous sections, although formidable, are not total. As Robert Young argues, Fanon himself spent much of his career as a psychiatrist investigating the inner effects of colonialism, in order to establish a means through which they could be resisted, turning the inculcation of inferiority into self-empowerment. Here I argue that the self-affirmative logic underlying Fanon's writings on anti-colonial agency and empowerment offer a potential means of evading the liberal politics of recognition's tendency to produce colonial subjects. The groundwork laid in Section 3 will provide a launching point for my discussion in Chapter 5 and my conclusion, where the theory and practice of indigenous anti-colonialism as a research and practice of cultural self-recognition will be taken up in more detail. And finally, in the last section, I address an important counter-argument to my position through a critical engagement with the work of Anishinaabe political philosopher Recognition from Hegel's master slave to Charles Taylor's politics of recognition. It is now commonly acknowledged that one of Hegel's most enduring contributions to contemporary social, political thought has been his concept of quote-unquote recognition. The words of Nancy Fraser and Axel Honneth. Whether the issue is indigenous land claims or women's care work, homosexual marriage or Muslim headscarves, the term quote-unquote recognition is increasingly used to unpack the normative basis of today's political claims. Recognition has become a key word of our time. For my purposes here, it will suffice to limit my discussion of Hegel's theory of recognition to his chapter Lordship and Bondage, and the Phenomenology of Spirit. This narrower approach can be justified on two grounds. First, although others have recognized the importance of Hegel's earlier and later writings on recognition, Fanon was primarily concerned, following Alexander Kojève and Jean-Paul Sartre, with recognition. In this respect, it has been suggested that Fanon's work can be read as an important, yet largely ignored, contribution to the so-called Hegel Renaissance that occurred in France's intellectual scene after World War II. The second justification is that this chapter is not about Hegel per se. Rather, it concerns the contemporary appropriation, whether implicit or explicit, of his theory of recognition by activists, political theorists, and policymakers working on issues pertaining to Indigenous self-determination in Canada. Only once I have teased out the logic of recognition at play in Hegel's master-slave narrative can I begin to unpack and problematize this appropriation. As suggested in the previous chapter, at its core, Hegel's master-slave narrative can be read in at least two ways that continue to inform contemporary recognition-based theories of liberal pluralism. On the first reading, Hegel's dialectic outlines a theory of recognition formation that cuts against the classical liberal view of the subject insofar as it situates social relations as the fore of human subjectivity. On this account, relations of recognition are deemed constitutive of subjectivity. One becomes an individual subject only in virtue of recognizing, and being recognized by another subject. Our senses of self are thus dependent on and shaped through our complex relations with others. This insight into the introspective nature of identity formation underlies Hegel's often quoted assertion that, quote, self-consciousness exists in and for itself when and by the fact that it exists for another. That is, it exists only in being acknowledged, unquote. So important. If any of you have followed me while I read Juche, I'm sure this is sounding a little bit familiar to you. On the second reading, the dialectic moves beyond highlighting the rational nature of human subjectivity to elucidate what Hegel sees as the intersubjective conditions required for the realization of human freedom. From this perspective, the master-slave narrative can be read in a normative light, in that it suggests that the realization of oneself is an essential, self-determining agent requires that one not only be recognized as self-determining, but that one be recognized by another self-consciousness that is also recognized as self-determining. It is through these reciprocal processes and exchanges of recognition that the condition of possibility for freedom emerges. You're familiar with Hegel's work a little bit? I'm at least familiar with what he's saying in that quote. Interesting. Yeah, and like I said, one thing I think if you've ever studied like Juche philosophy of Jesus Christ from DPRK. What the fuck did I just do here? Oh, if you have been with me while we've been studying Juche philosophy from DPRK, you'll also notice like how closely this is resembling a lot of what is said there as well. Very interesting. Our senses of self are thus dependent. Sorry, that was the part I just read. On the second reading, the dialectic moves beyond highlighting the relational nature of human subjectivity to elucidate what Hegel sees as the intersubjective conditions required for the realization of human freedom. Now, what I do find extremely the reason I would say why Juche is similar in like scope and rhetoric to this is due to the fact that, of course, Juche arose to explain the subjective human factors of revolution in contrast to the material conditions that govern revolution. And I think that's why, of course, you are going to see a similarity here if you study Juche. And and I would say if you study Fanon as well. I constantly tell people when I read Fanon, I see more Juche than I do classic Marxist-Leninist work, and that it's a mistake, I think, to call Fanon, in fact, a Marxist-Leninist. I think you're categorizing him into something that he's not necessarily would have categorized himself as, like a progressive, communist, whatever, for sure. But to label him that, I think, is a mistake. As we see, a lot of Fanon's work really is coming from analyzing Hegel more than Marx himself. Although he does read and study Marx, but he sort of brings it back and synthesizes it with Hegel in many ways. At least with many of Hegel's ideas. Fanon is absolutely a category of its own. I see so many Euros and settlers trying to like box him into being an ML for some reason. It's like, I mean, it's the same for me, right? People like qualify, like they want to qualify whether they should follow me or whether they should listen to my politics or whatever based on whether or not I'm quote unquote ML. Well, I'm a communist that supports socialism. Whatever the fuck you want to call that is up to you, I guess. But I'll just call it a communist. And why don't you come along and learn with me? From this perspective, the master-slave narrative can be read in a normative light in that it suggests the realization of oneself as an essential self-determining agent requires that not only the recognized as self-determining, but the one be recognized by another self-consciousness that is also recognized as self-determining. It is through these reciprocal processes and exchanges of recognition that the condition of possibility for freedom emerges. Hence Hegel's repeated insistence that relations of recognition must be mutual. This point is driven home in the latter half of Hegel's section Lordship and Bondage, when he discusses the ironic fate of the master in the context of asymmetrical recognition. After the life and death struggle between the two self-consciousnesses temporarily cashes out in the hierarchical master-slave relationship, Hegel goes on to depict a surprising turn of events in which the master's desire for recognition as an essential being for itself is thwarted by the fact that he or she is only recognized by the unessential and dependent consciousness of the slave. And of course, recognition by a slave hardly constitutes recognition at all. In this one-sided and unequal relationship, master fails to gain certainty of being for self as the truth of himself. On the contrary, his truth is in reality the unessential consciousness of its unessential action. Meanwhile, the master continues to wallow in his sluggish state of increased dependency. The slave, through his or her transformative labor, becomes conscious of what he truly is, and qua worker, comes to realize his own independence, quote unquote. Thus, in the end, the truth of independent consciousness and one's status as a self-determining actor is realized more through the praxis of the slave, through his or her transformative work in and on the world. However, here it is important to note that for Hegel, quote, the revolution of the slave is not simply to replace the master, while maintaining the unequal hierarchy recognition, unquote. This, of course, would only temporarily invert the relation, and the slave would eventually meet the same fate as the master. Rather, as Robert Williams reminds us, Hegel's project was to move, quote, beyond the patterns of domination and inequality, unquote, that typify the asymmetrical relations of recognition as such. It is also on this point that many contemporary theorists of recognition remain committed. In Bound by Recognition, Patch and Markle suggest that one of the most significant differences between recognition in Hegel's master-slave and the politics of recognition today is that state institutions tend to play a fundamental role in mediating relations of recognition in the latter, but not the former. For example, regarding policies aimed at preserving cultural diversity, Merkel writes, quote, far from being simple face-to-face encounters between subjects a la Hegel's stylized story in Phenomenology, unquote, multiculturalism tends to, quote, involve large-scale exchanges of recognition in which states typically play a crucial role, unquote. Charles Taylor's The Politics of Recognition provides a particularly salient example of this. In this essay, Taylor draws on the insights of Hegel, among others, to mount a sustained critique of what he claims to be the increased, impracticable nature of difference-blind liberalism when applied to culturally diverse polities such as United States and Canada. Alternatively, Taylor defends a variant of liberal thought that posits that, under certain circumstances, diverse states can indeed recognize and accommodate a range of group-specific claims without having to abandon their commitment to a core set of fundamental rights. Furthermore, these types of claims can be defended on liberal grounds because it is within and against the horizon of one's cultural community that individuals come to develop their identities, and thus the capacity to make sense of their lives and life choices. In short, our identities provide the, quote, background against which our tastes and desires and opinions and aspirations make sense. Without this orienting framework, we would be unable to derive meaning from our lives. We would not know who we are or where we are coming from. We would be at sea, as Taylor puts it elsewhere. Thus, much like Hegel before him, Taylor argues that human actors do not develop their identities in isolation. Rather, they are formed through dialogue with others, in agreement or struggle with their recognition of us. However, given that our identities are formed through these relations, it also follows that they can be significantly deformed when these processes go awry. This is what Taylor means when he asserts that identities are shaped not only by recognition, but also in absence. Quote, often by their misrecognition of others, a group or a person of people can suffer real damage, real distortion, if the people or society around them mirror back to them a confining or demeaning or contemptible picture of themselves. Non-recognition or misrecognition can inflict harm, can be a form of oppression, imprisoning one in a false, disoriented, and reduced mode of being, unquote. This idea that asymmetrical relations of recognition can impede human freedom by imprisoning someone in a distorted relation to self is asserted repeatedly in Taylor's essay. For instance, we are frequently told that disparaging forms of recognition can inflict wounds on their victims, saddling them with a crippling self-hatred, or that withholding recognition can inflict damage on those who are denied it. And given the misrecognition that the capacity to harm others in this manner, it follows, according to Taylor, that it must be considered a form of oppression, on par with injustices such as inequality and exploitation. In Taylor, recognition is elevated to the status of vital human need. What's interesting too about this is let's compare this again to Juche, which says that humanity's consciousness, is made possible through humans' highly developed brain, right? Our biological attributes make consciousness possible. But the human consciousness itself is not something that just comes forth from our biology out of nowhere. It's not just granted to us by our biology, but rather it is something that is gained through the course of living in a human collective, in the intercourse between other humans or relations with other humans. That is what forms social consciousness. And that social consciousness does not exist within your brain, but rather it's the totality of society, basically. And not only of society, but of history, which is, of course, how our knowledge improves over periods of time. How we go from using, tools that are essentially ready-made things in nature, sticks as clubs, etc., to using highly developed and changed things that no longer resemble the raw materials that they're made from, even. At this point, the practical implications of Taylor's theory began to reveal themselves. In his more prescriptive moments, Taylor suggests that, in Canada, both the Quebecois and Indigenous people exemplify the types of threatened minorities that ought to be considered eligible for some forms of recognition, capable of accommodating their cultural distinctives. Got your coffee? Good, coffee is great. Coffee and theory goes very well together, does it not? For Indigenous people specifically, this might require the delegation of political and cultural autonomy to Native groups through the institutions of self-government. Elsewhere, Taylor suggests that this could mean, in practice, allowing for a new form of jurisdiction in Canada, perhaps weaker than the provinces, but unlike municipalities. Accommodating the claims of First Nations in this way would ideally allow Native communities to, quote, preserve their cultural integrity, unquote, and thus help stave off the psychological disorientation and resulted unfreedom associated with exposure to structured patterns of mis- or non-recognition. In this way, the institutionalization of liberal regime of reciprocal recognition would enable Indigenous people to realize their status as distinct and self-determining actors. Still waiting on yours. Damn, that must be a complex coffee, Sean. Although it is true that the normative dimensions of Taylor's project represents an improvement over Canada's past tactics of exclusion, genocide, and assimilation. The following section, I argue that the logic informing this dimension, where recognition, quote-unquote, is conceived as something that is ultimately granted or accorded a subaltern group or entirely by a dominant group or entity, prefigures its failure to signify, modify, let alone transcend the breadth of power at play in colonial relationships. I also hope to show that Fanon, whose work Taylor relies on to delineate this relationship between misrecognition and the forms of unfreedom and subjection discussed above, anticipated this failure over 50 years ago. Funny how they always do that. Lenin has some very similar. You'll find Lenin with some very similar things. But on this, channel, we don't want to just read Lenin. We read Lenin too, but we also want to read Fanon. And those, again, there's people that perhaps are classic Euro-Marxists would say aren't necessarily MLs, so therefore don't give them that close of a study. Like, fuck off with that rhetoric. Study Settlers, read Settlers, please. Read Fanon, and listen to Glenn Sean Couthard. And if you can't read them, tune in and I'll fucking read them to you. Well, Sean, you hang out long enough and I'll just study it to you. I'll study it out loud with you, eventually. Frantz Fanon's Socio-Diagnostic Critique of Recognition Politics. The second half of Politics of Recognition Taylor identifies Fanon's classic The Wretched of the Earth as one of the first texts to elicit the role that misrecognition plays in propping up relations of domination. By extension, Fanon's analysis in Wretched of the Earth is also used to support one of the central political arguments underlying Taylor's analysis, namely, his call for the cultural recognition of sub-state groups that have suffered at the hands of a hegemonic political power. Although Taylor acknowledges that Fanon advocated violent struggle as the primary means of overcoming the psycho-essential complexes instilled in colonial subjects by misrecognition, he nonetheless insists that Fanon's argument is applicable to contemporary debates surrounding the politics of difference, more generally. Below, I want to challenge Taylor's use of Fanon in this context. Not by disputing Taylor's assertion that Fanon's work constitutes an important theorization of the ways in which the subjectivities of the oppressed can be deformed by mis- or non-recognition, but rather by contesting the assumption that a more accommodating liberal regime of mutual recognition might be capable of addressing the power relations typical of those between indigenous peoples and settler states. Interestingly, Fanon posed a similar challenge in his earlier work, Black Skin, White Masks. Fanon's concern with the relationship between human freedom and equality in relations of recognition represents a central and recurring theme in Black Skin, White Masks. As mentioned at the outset of this chapter, it was there that Fanon convincingly argued that the long-term stability of a colonial system of governments relies as much on the internalization of the forms of racist recognition imposed or bestowed on the indigenous population by the colonial state and society as it does brute force. For Fanon, then, the longevity of colonial social formation depends, to a significant degree, on its capacity to transform the colonialized population to subjects of imperial rule. Here, Fanon anticipates at least one aspect of the well-known work of French Marxist philosopher Louis Althusser, who would later argue that the reproduction of capitalist relations of production rests on the recognition function of ideology, namely, the ability of the state's ideological apparatus to interpolate individuals as subjects of class rule. For Fanon, colonialism operates a similarly dual-structured manner. It includes, quote, not only interrelations of objective historical conditions, but also human attitudes to these conditions, unquote. Fanon argued that it was the interplay between the structural objective and recognitive subjective features of colonialism that ensured its hegemony over time. With respect to the subjective dimension, Black Skin, White Mask painstakingly outlines the myriad ways in which those attitudes conducive to colonial rule are cultivated among the colonized through the unequal exchange of institutionalized and interpersonal patterns of recognition between the colonial society and the indigenous population. In effect, Fanon showed how, over time, colonized populations tend to internalize the derogatory images imposed on them by their colonial masters, and how, as a result of this process, these images, along with the structural relations with which they are intertwined, come to be recognized, or at least endured, as more or less natural. This point is made agonizingly clear in arguably the most famous passage from Black Skin, White Mask, where Fanon shares an alienating encounter on the streets of Paris with a little white child. "Look, a Negro," Fanon recalled the child saying. "Mama, see the Negro? I'm frightened, frightened." At that moment, the imposition of the child's racist gaze sealed Fannin into a crushing objecthood, fixing him like a chemical solution is fixed by a dye. He found himself temporarily accepting that he was indeed the subject of the child's call. It is true. It was true. It amused me, thought Fannin. But then, quote, I subjected myself to an objective examination. I discovered my blackness, my ethnic characteristics. And I was battered down by the tom-toms, cannibalism, intellectual deficiency, fetishism, racial defects, unquote. Far from assuring Fannin's humanity, the other's recognition imprisoned him in an externally determined and devalued conception of himself. Instead of being acknowledged as a man among men, he was reduced to an object among other objects. Left as is, Fannin's insight into the ultimately subjectifying nature of colonial recognition appears to square nicely with Taylor's work. For example, although Fannin never uses the term himself, he appears to be mapping a deliberating effect associated with misrecognition, in the sense that Taylor uses the term. Indeed, black skin, white masks, littered with passages highlighting the innumerable ways in which the imposition of the settler's gaze can inflict damages on indigenous societies at both the individual and collective levels. Taylor is more or less explicit about his debt to Fannin in this respect too. Since 1492, he writes, with the wretched of the earth in mind, Europeans have projected an image of the colonized as somehow inferior, uncivilized, and through the force of conquest have been able to impose this image on the conquered. Even with these similarities, however, I believe that a close reading of Black Skin, White Mask renders problematic Taylor's approach in several interrelated and crucial respects. The first problem has to do with its failure to adequately confront the dual structure of colonialism itself. Fannin insisted, for example, that a colonial configuration of power could be transformed only if attacked at both levels of operation, the objective and the subjective. And again, this is what, remember that, as I was saying earlier, this is what Juche arose to determine. We have Marxism for understanding the objective in a scientific manner, and we have Juche for understanding society, or the subjective, in that same manner. This point is made at the outset of Black Skin, White Mask, and reverberates through all of Fannin's work. As indicated in his introduction, although a significant amount of Black Skin, White Mask would highlight and explore the psychological terrain of colonialism, this would not be done in a manner decoupled from an analysis of its structural or material foundations. This is the most important thing for people who were then try to claim that somehow Fannin has anything to do with idealism or deviating from an actual material understanding of the world. These people think that whenever you talk about ideas or how ideas affect the world around us, that somehow you're then delving into idealism. That's not what idealism means. Stop saying it or fucking and learn what idealism actually fucking means, if you want to say that. Indeed, Fannin claimed that there will be an authentic disalienation. Yeah, they're colonized brains. Child Mind Institute. Extremely smooth. Of the colonized subject, only to the degree to which things, in most materialistic meaning of the word, return to their proper places. Hence the term socio-diagnostic for Fannin's project. Quote, if there is inferiority complex, it is the outcome of a double process, primarily economic, subsequently the internalization of his inferiority. Unquote. In Fanon, colonial capitalist exploitation and domination is correctly situated alongside misrecognition and alienation as foundational sources of colonial injustice. The quote-unquote Negro problem, writes Fanon, does not resolve itself into the problem of Negroes living among white men, but rather of Negroes being exploited, enslaved, despised by a colonist, capitalist society that is only accidentally white. Fanon was enough of a Marxist to understand the role played by capitalism in exacerbating hierarchical relations of recognition. I love this part, by the way. However, he was also much more perceptive than many Marxists of his day in his insistence that the subjective realm of colonialism be the target of strategic transformation along with the socio-economic structure. The colonized person must wage war on both levels, insisted Fanon, since historically they influence each other. Any unilateral liberation is incomplete, and the gravest mistake would be to believe in their automatic interdependence. For Fanon, attacking colonial power on one front, in other words, would not guarantee the subversion of its effects on the other. Oh, that's so good. I'll tell you why in a second. This is why a Marxist analysis should always be slightly stretched when it comes to addressing the colonial issue. Why you should use Juche. Fanon would later write in The Wretched of the Earth. Here, I would argue that Fanon's stretching of the Marxist paradigm constitutes one of the most innovative contributions to classical Marxist debates on ideology. Unlike the position of, say, Georg Lucas, who boldly claimed in History and Class Consciousness that there is no problem, and therefore no solution, that does not ultimately lead back to the question of economic structure. And this, again, is the Marxists we see today. These fucking dogmatists who, when you tried to teach them about Juche or Fanon or some other Marxist thinker who wasn't, or some other communist thinker who wasn't strictly ML, this is exactly what they begin to fall into. This exact same narrative of saying, oh, it all leads back to the question of economic structure, of what we modernly term as class reductionists. Sure, you've all seen this term. Fanon revealed the ways in which those axes of domination, historically regulated in Marxism to the superstructural realm, such as racism and the effects it has on those subjects to it, could substantively configure the character of social relations relatively autonomously from capitalist economics. Oh, that one hurts them. I can hear the dogmatist crying about that last sentence, saying that the superstructural realm, what Marx considers the superstructural realm, that changing that superstructural realm could substantially configure the character of social relations relatively autonomously from capitalist economics. Bam! And you know what? That in itself disproves the old Marx idea, which Marx himself became to reject by the end of his life, by the way, that capitalism must emerge, socialism must emerge where capitalism is highly developed, right? Lenin fought against this, but he wasn't able to put it in the same way that Fanon did here, because Lenin, I would say, also in many respects, like Lenin was very good, of course, our fucking Lord Lenin, but the thing was he didn't quite think in the subjective realm like Fanon did, I would say. Or and it's, this is why, okay, look at the next work we're going to read. And I want to show you what the next work we're going to read is and why I'm fucking over the moon about picking this as the next work. I think is great because it really complements what we're reading right now. This is another statement that hurts those dogmatists. Giving priority to ideological work is essential for accomplishing socialism. They see this and go, what? We have to use our ideas? That's idealism, isn't it? Right? That's what we always hear, and that itself is an expression of this class reductionism. It's funny. And like even Kim Jong-il, Kim Jong-il went even further, and he said that the thing that determines whether revolution will succeed in one country or the other has very, very little to do actually with its current material conditions. The existence of revolutionaries has to do with the existence of capitalist society in the world, of course. That was required. That was the material condition for class consciousness to emerge, right? That much is obvious. But to think that every society, what you're getting into when you're making this mistake of thinking that the most important factor is the material conditions, i.e., how far along the productive forces are, what you're falling into is this idea then that every society must become capitalist before it can become socialist, which again is an idea that Lenin himself fought against. What Kim Jong-il says, rather, the determining factor in whether revolution will break out in a country or not is not whether the material conditions are favorable, because revolutions have broken out in places where the material conditions are in fact very unfavorable, where there is not developed capitalism, where there is extreme exploitation and oppression, where there is not even a majority fucking proletariat, okay? This is where revolution has broken out. So why has it broken out there? Well, Lenin, again, trying to use a purely materialistic analysis, he answers, well, it breaks where the chain of imperialism is the weakest. Because from his perspective in Russia, that seemed to be the case. But again, we're analyzing strictly material, and we're leaving out a key factor in revolution when we use this analysis. People. The key factor in revolution is the masses, the people. There is no other being that causes revolution to happen other than the being of people, the masses of people, collectively. They cause revolution. They become conscious of their own interests and they struggle to materialize those interests. And this is what causes revolution to break out. In other words, it's the revolutionary consciousness of the masses that causes revolution to break out or not. If the masses are captured by reactionary ideology, it does not matter how highly developed the material forces are. It does not matter any of that. If the revolutionary consciousness is very low and the masses are captured by reactionary ideas, they will continue to fight against their interests. Pure and simple. And that's why in the West, in the capitalist developed countries, where the chain of imperialism is in fact quite weak, you don't not have revolution breaking out because you have large labor aristocracy that acts itself as an independent colonial police. And why does it do this? Because of, again, that reactionary ideology. The key factor in whether revolution occurs or not is ideology. You want to call me an idealist for that? You're wrong, but go ahead. Lately, a number of scholars have taken aim at the contribution of recognition theorists like Taylor on analogous grounds, that their work offers little insight into how to address the more overtly structural and or economic features of social oppression. See, that sentence is exactly why this shit gets me all hot and bothered. We have also been told that this lack of insight has contributed to a shift in the terrain of contemporary political thought and practice more generally, from redistribution of recognition, to use Nancy Fraser's formulation. According to Fraser, where proponents of redistribution tend to highlight and confront injustices in the economic sphere, advocates of the newer politics of recognition tend to focus on and attack injustices in the cultural realm. On the redistribution front, proposed remedies for injustice range from between affirmative strategies, like the administration of welfare, to more transformative methods, like the transformation of capitalist mode of production itself. In contrast, strategies aimed at injustices associated with misrecognition tend to focus on cultural and symbolic change, Again, this could involve affirmative approaches, such as the recognition and affirmation of previously disparaged identities, or these strategies could adopt a more transformative role, such as deconstruction of dominant patterns of representation in ways that would change everyone's social identities. I think that Fanon's work, which anticipates the recognition redistribution debate by half a century, highlights several key shortcomings in the approaches of both Taylor and Fraser. Taylor's approach is insufficient insofar as it tends to, at its best, address the political economy of colonialism in a strictly affirmative manner. For reformist state redistribution schemes like granting certain cultural rights and concessions to Aboriginal communities via self-government and land claims packages. Although this approach may alter the intensity of some of the effects of colonial capitalist exploitation and domination, it does little to address their generative structures. In the case of capitalist economy constituted by racial and gender hierarchies and the colonial state. When his work is at its weakest, however, Taylor tends to focus on the recognition end of the spectrum too much, and as a result leaves uninterrogated colonialism's deep-seated structural features. Richard J. F. Day has succinctly framed the problem this way, quote, although Taylor's recognition model allows for diversity of culture within a particular state by admitting the possibility of multiple national identifications, unquote, it is less, quote, permissive with regard to polity and economy, in assuming that any subaltern group that is granted recognition will thereby acquire a subordinate articulation within a capitalist state, unquote. Seen from this angle, Taylor's theory leaves one of two operative levels of colonial power identified by Fanon untouched. This line of criticism is well worn and can be traced back to at least the early works of Karl Marx. As such, I doubt that many would be surprised that Taylor's variant of liberalism, as liberalism fails to confront the structural or economic aspects of colonialism as its generative roots. To my mind, however, this shortcoming in Taylor's approach is particularly surprising, given the fact that, although many indigenous leaders in communities today tend to instrumentally couch their claims in reformist terms, this has not always been the case. Indeed, historically, indigenous demands for cultural recognition have often been expressed in ways that have been explicitly called into question the dominating nature of capitalist social relations in the state form. And the same can be said of a growing number of today's most prominent indigenous scholars and activists. Mohawk political scientist Tyaki Alfred, for example, has repeatedly argued that the goal of any traditionally rooted self-determination struggle ought to be protect that which constitutes the, quote, heart and soul of indigenous nations, a set of values that challenges the homogenizing force Western liberalism and free market capitalism, that honors the autonomy of individual conscious, non-coercive authority, and the deep interconnected between human beings and other elements of creation. For Alfred, this vision is not only embodied in the practical philosophies and ethical systems of many North American indigenous societies, but also flows from a realization that capitalist economics and liberal delusions of progress have historically served as the engines of colonial aggression and injustice itself. My point here is that an approach that is explicitly oriented around dialogue and listening ought to be more sensitive to the claims and challenges emanating from these dissenting indigenous voices. However, If Taylor's account pays insignificant attention to the clearly structural and economic realm of domination, then Fraser's does so from the opposite angle. In order to avoid what she sees as the pitfalls associated with the politics of recognition's latent essentialism and displacement of questions of distributive justice, Fraser proposes a means of integrating struggles for recognition with those of redistribution without subordinating one to the other. To this end, Fraser suggests that instead of understanding recognition as a revaluation of cultural or group-specific identity, and misrecognition as a disparaging of such identity and its consequent effects on the subjectivities of minorities, recognition and misrecognition should be conceived of in terms of the institutionalized patterns of value that affect one's ability to participate as a peer in social life. To view recognition in this manner, writes Fraser, is to treat it as an issue of social status. Although Fraser's status model allows her to curtail some problems she attributes to identity politics, it does so at the expense of addressing two of the most pertinent features of injustices related to mis- or non-recognition in colonial contexts. First, when applied to indigenous struggles of recognition, Fraser's status model rests on problematic background assumption that the settler state constitutes a legitimate framework within which indigenous peoples might be more justly included, or from which they could be further excluded. Here, Fraser, like Taylor, leaves intact two features of colonial domination that indigenous assertions of nationhood call into question: the legitimacy of the settler state claim to sovereignty over indigenous people and their territories on one hand, and the normative status of the state form as an appropriate mode of governance on the other. Indeed, at one point in her well-known exchange with Axel Honneth, Fraser hints at her theory's weakness in this regard. While discussing the work Will Kimlicka, Fraser admits that her status model may not be as suited to situations where claims of recognition contest a current distribution of state sovereignty. Where Kimlicka's approach is tailored to demands for recognition in multinational societies, Fraser's project, we are told, seeks to address such demands in polyethnic polities like the United States. The problem with this caveat, however, is that it is premised on the recognition of its own, namely, that as a state founded on the dispossessed territories of previously self-determining but now colonized indigenous nations, the United States is a multinational state in much the way that Canada is. My second concern is this: if many of today's most volatile political conflicts do include subjective or physiological dimensions to them in the way that Fraser admits, and Taylor and Fanon describe, then I fear her approach, which attempts to eschew a different engagement with this aspect of social oppression, risks leaving an important contributing dynamic to identity-related forms of domination unchecked. By avoiding this psychologizing tendency within the politics of recognition, Fraser claims to have located what is wrong with misrecognition in social relations, and not, quote, individual interpersonal psychology. This is preferable, we are told, because when misrecognition is identified with internal distortions in the structure of the consciousness of the oppressed, it is but a short step to blaming the victim. This does not have to be the case. Fanon, for example, was unambiguous with respect to locating the cause of the inferiority complex of colonized subjects in the colonial social structure. The problem, however, is that any psychological problem that ensue, although socially constituted, can take on a life of their own, and thus need to be dealt with independently and in accordance with their own specific logics. As mentioned previously, Fanon was insistent that a change in social structure would not guarantee a change in subjectivities of the oppressed. Stated simply, if Fanon's insight into the interdependent yet semi-autonomous nature of the two facets of colonial power is correct, then dumping all our efforts into alleviating the institutional or structural impediments of participatory parity, whether redistributive or recognitive, may not do anything to undercut the deliberating forms of unfreedom related to misrecognition in the traditional sense. This brings us to the second key problem with Taylor's theory when applied to colonial contexts. I've already suggested that Taylor's liberal recognition approach is incapable of curbing the damages wrought within and against indigenous communities by the structures of state and capital. But what about his theory of recognition? Does it suffer the same fate vis-a-vis the forms of power that it seeks to undercut? As noted in the previous section, underlying Taylor's theory is the assumption that the flourishing of indigenous peoples as distinct and self-determining entities is significantly dependent on their being afforded cultural recognition and institutional accommodation by the settler state apparatus. What makes this approach both so intriguing and so problematic, however, is that Fanon, whom Taylor uses to make his case, argued against a similar presumption in the penultimate chapter of Black Skin, White Masks. Moreover, like Taylor, Fanon did so with reference to Hegel's master-slave parable. There, Fanon argued that the dialectical progression to reciprocity in relations of recognition is frequently undermined in colonial situations by the fact that, unlike the subjected slave in Hegel's phenomenology of spirit, many colonized societies no longer have to struggle for their freedom and independence. It is often negotiated, achieved through constitutional amendment, or simply declared by the settler state and bestowed upon the indigenous population in the form of political rights. Whatever the method, in these circumstances the colonized, quote, steeped in the essentiality of servitude, unquote, are set free by the master. One day the white master, without conflict, recognized the Negro slave, unquote. As such, they do not have to lay down their lives to prove their certainty of being in the way that Hegel insisted. The upheaval of formal freedom and independence thus reaches the colonized from without. The black man acted upon values that are not created by his actions, values that are not born of the systolic tide of his blood in hued world around him. The upheaval does not make a difference in the Negro. He goes from one way of life to another, but not from one life to another, unquote. There are a number of important issues underlying Fanon's concern here. The first involves the relationship he draws between struggle and the disalienation of the colonized subject. For Fanon, it is through struggle and conflict, and for the later Fanon, violent struggle and conflict, that imperial subjects come to be rid of their arsenal of complexes, driven into the core of their being through the colonial process. I will have more to say about this aspect of Fanon's thought below, but for now, I simply want to flag the fact that the struggle serves as a mediating force through which the colonized come to shed their colonial identities, thus restoring them to their proper places. In contexts where recognition is conferred without struggle or conflict, The fundamental transformation, or as Lou Turner has put it, this internal differentiation in the level of colonized being cannot occur, thus foreclosing the realization of freedom. Hence, Fanon's claim that the colonized simply go from one way of life to another, but not from one life to another. The structure on domination is modified, and the subject position of the colonized remains unchanged. They become, quote, emancipated slaves, unquote. The second important point to note is that when Fanon speaks of the lack of struggle in the decolonization movements of his day, he does not mean to suggest that the colonized in these contexts simply remained passive recipients of colonial practices. He readily admits, for example, that from time to time, the colonized may indeed fight for liberty and justice. However, when this fight is carried out in a manner that does not pose the foundational break with the background structures of colonial power as such, which for Fanon will always invoke struggle and conflict, then the best the colonized can hope for is white liberty and white justice. That is, values secreted by their masters. Without conflict and struggle, the terms of recognition tend to remain in possession of those in power, to bestow on their inferiors in ways that they deem appropriate. Note the double level of subjection here. Without transformative struggle constituting an integral aspect of anti-colonial praxis, the indigenous population will not only remain subjects of imperial rule, insofar as they have not gone through the process of purging the psycho-essential complexes battered into them over the course of their colonial experience, a process of strategic desubjectification. But they will also remain in that the indigenous society will tend to come to see the forms of structurally limited and constrained recognition conferred to them by colonial masters as their own. That is, the colonized will begin to identify with, quote, white liberty and white justice, unquote. Fanon would later phrase it in The Wretched of the Earth. These values eventually seep into the colonized and subtly structure and limit the possibility of their freedom. Either way, for Fanon, the colonized will have failed to re-establish themselves as truly self-determining, as creators of the terms, values, and conditions by which they are to be recognized. My third concern with Taylor's politics of recognition involves a misguided sociological assumption that undergirds his appropriation of Hegel's notion of mutual recognition. As noted in the previous section, at the heart of Hegel's master-slave dialectic is the idea that both parties, engaged in the struggle for recognition, are dependent on the other's acknowledgement for their freedom and self-worth. Moreover, Hegel asserts that this dependency is even more crucial for the master in the relationship, for unlike the slave, he or she is unable to achieve independence and objective self-certainty through the object of his or her own labor. Mutual dependency thus appears to be the background condition that ensures the dialectic progress towards reciprocity. This is why Taylor claims, with reference to Hegel, that, quote, the structure for recognition can only find one satisfactory solution, and that is a regime of reciprocal recognition among equals, unquote. However, as Fanon's work reminds us, the problem with this formulation is that when applied to actual struggles for recognition between hegemonic and some alternate communities, the mutual character of dependency rarely exists. This observation is made in a lengthy footnote in Black Skin, White Mask, where Fanon claims to have shown how the colonial master basically differs from the master depicted in Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. Quote, for Hegel, there is reciprocity, but in the colonies, the master laughs at the consciousness of the slave. What he wants from the slave is not recognition, but work. End quote. To my mind, This is one of the most crucial passages in Black Skin, White Mask, for it outlines in precise terms what is wrong with the recognition paradigm when abstracted from the face-to-face encounter in Hegel's dialectic and applied to colonial situations. Although the issue here is an obvious one, it has nonetheless been critically overlooked in the contemporary recognition literature. In relations of domination that exist between nation states and the sub-state national groups that they quote-unquote incorporate into their territorial and jurisdictional boundaries, there is no mutual dependency in terms of a need or desire for recognition. In these contexts, the quote-unquote master, that is, the colonial state and state society, does not require recognition from the previously self-determining communities upon which its territorial, economic, and social structure is constituted. What it needs is land, labor, and resources. Thus, rather than leading to a condition of reciprocity, the dialectic either breaks down with the explicit non-recognition of the unequal status of the colonized population, or with the strategic domestication of the terms of recognition, leaving the foundation of the colonial relationship relatively undisturbed. What up, Red Falcon? Just reading Red Skin, White Mask, Part 1. And also explaining how it relates a little bit to Juche philosophy and how much of what it recognizes as like many of these subjective factors playing into human development that existed in Fagel perhaps were overlooked. I think you might be the only one in here. Be honest with you. Anyone familiar? Anyway, I will continue. Yeah, I think this is why it's such a, as I mentioned just a little while ago, I think this is why it's such a good idea for us to read after we're done Red Skin, White Mask. For us to next read, giving priority to ideological work is essential for accomplishing socialism because it goes into this whole what role ideas actually play in revolution and liberation. Oh, really? Weird. It shows one on my end. You never know which one's accurate, though. Yeah, I think this is so important, though, because like Marxism, Leninism, and I think many Western Marxists fall into this sort of economic determinist like view, where they think all that matters is economics, and like as Glenn Sean Coulthard is trying to point out, and as Fanon tried to point out before him, that this recognition and what people are thinking play a key factor in revolution itself. And as I just said, what causes revolution to occur, even more so than the material conditions themselves, right, is the revolutionary ideology of the masses. GMO is here too. That's good. I mean, my thing is, at least even if I don't have anyone watching right now, I'm sure someone will watch this later. And motherfuckers in the West need to read Red Skin, White Masks. That's why we're reading this. So make sure you spread this around when I'm done. Anyone familiar with the power dynamics that structure the Aboriginal rights movement in Canada should immediately see the applicability of Fanon's insights here. Again, don't call Fanon a Marxist-Leninist. You're doing him a disservice and you're insulting a whole bunch of people when you do. Just like myself, again, like, I think if you call me a Marxist-Leninist, you're putting me in a box that I don't necessarily put myself in. I mean, go ahead if you want, but I prefer the term communist. Thank you so much, GMO. Very much appreciate the puff. And I hope reading this and Fanon's work will also, in additionally, show comrades that Juche didn't just arise out of nowhere. That these ideas have inheritance, you know, with the larger movement for understanding human development. Indeed, one need not expand much effort to elicit the countless ways in which the liberal discourse of recognition has been limited to constrained by the state, the courts, corporate interests, and policymakers in ways that have helped preserve the colonial status quo. Universal appeal / existence, exactly. We do need a fan and emote. Yeah. This channel we're going for a fan and emote. We're going for even if the new leader of Burkina Faso, he very inspiring stuff. I think maybe we should make a meme and emote with him as well. That could be our salute. If we could find a good one of him saluting or something, that would make a great salute meme for the channel. With respect to the law, for example, over the last 30 years, the Supreme Court of Canada has consistently refused to recognize Aboriginal peoples' equal and self-determining status based on its adherence to a legal precedent founded on the white supremacist myth that Indigenous societies were too primitive to bear political rights when they first encountered European powers. We had more advanced political societies than they did. Our politics, First Nations politics, were far more advanced than anything the fucking West was doing. But what they have, domination, class-based societies. Societies based on slave existences. And they came and saw us societies as being quote-unquote primitive. I don't know why, but the Bugs Bunny one always gives me hand talk, trade terms, acceptance vibes. I always see it as like a pay attention type of emote, you know? Yeah, exactly, GMO. Good point. The Euros didn't even know how to wash their goddamn asses. They would have starved, not to say nothing of the fact that they would have just starved, right? Thus, even though the courts have secured an unprecedented degree of protection for certain cultural practices within the state, they have nonetheless repeatedly refused to challenge the racist origin of Canada's assumed sovereign authority over Indigenous peoples and their territories. And this is the most important thing, right? Every time we get this recognition, this land back here, the land back here, they call it, right? Without actually being land back, just a return of some, territories that rightfully belong to those people. It's always with this recognition that Canada has this sovereign authority over all the other Indigenous nations. And, even the way I would say, like, perhaps my greatest criticism of the Communist Party of Canada here is that its strategy of it wanting to make what's called the House of Nations, whereby all the nations would have the right to like put forward proposals, etc. And nations, they say, where a matter is affecting their own lands, whatever that means, where matters affect their own lands, have a right to veto it. Well, unless you return all the land, if you're only talking about what exists in the communities in regards to reservations, etc., then you're also not addressing the colonial state. And that's my big criticism of that strategy by the Communist Party of Canada. Like, you have to actually fucking return all that land in order to say then those First Nations have a right to veto any decisions that are made about their own lands, right? If you say, okay, well, your lands are still what we forced you into on these reservations, you're not fucking decolonizing anything. You haven't given land back. Yeah, like it sounds nice to settlers. It sounds nice to settlers because it's like, oh, look, now we're putting them all, instead of the House of Senate, what we'll have is this big house where the settlers and all the First Nations can all have a vote on policy matters, But if it affects their own land, quote unquote land, whatever the fuck that means, again, do you mean reservations? Do you mean giving the land back and then whatever affects their traditional lands? And they don't specify that for, I think, a very important reason, right? And what ends up happening is, like, I don't know. It has to first start with with liberation, right, and land back. Otherwise, you always have this implicit unequalness in the relations, and even in the democracy. The political and economic ramifications of recent Aboriginal rights jurisprudence have been clear-cut. The Delamug versus British Columbia, it was declared that any residual Aboriginal rights that may have survived the unilateral assertion of Crown sovereignty could be infringed upon by the federal and provincial governments so long as this action could be shown to further, quote, a compelling and substantial legislative objective, unquote. That is, quote, consistent with the special fiduciary relationship between the Crown and the Aboriginal peoples, unquote. A little bit upset that this wasn't capital originally. I'm just saying. What substantial objectives might justify infringement? According to the court, virtually any exploitative economic venture, including the development of agriculture, forestry, mining, and hydroelectric power, the general economic development of the interior of British Columbia, protection of the environment or endangered species, and the building of infrastructure and the settlement of foreign populations to support those aims, unquote. So today, it appears, much as it did in Fannin's day, that colonial powers will only recognize the collective rights and identities of indigenous peoples insofar as this recognition does not throw into question the background, legal, political, and economic framework of the colonial relationship itself. But the above examples confirm only one aspect of Fannin's insight into the problem of recognition in colonial contexts, namely the limitations this approach runs up to against when pitted against those overtly structural expressions of domination. Are his criticisms and concerns equally relevant to the subjective or psycho-affirmative features of contemporary colonial power? With respect to the forms of racist recognition driven by the psyches of indigenous peoples through the institutions of state, church, schools, and media, and by racist individuals within the dominant society, the answer is clearly yes. Countless studies, novels, and autobiographical narratives have outlined in painful detail how these expressions have saddled individuals with low self-esteem, depression, alcohol, and drug abuse, and violent behaviors directed both inward against the self and outwards towards others. Yep, feel that. As part of that, I feel that shit so hard. That quote hurt me to read. Jesus Christ. That was wrenching to fucking read that. One sec. Taking another puff. The cooldown's not gone yet. Okay. Sorry, comrades. That part fucking burned me good. Feel this one. How expressions have saddled individuals with low self-esteem, depression, alcohol, drug use, and violent behaviors directed both inward against the self and outwards towards others. Some American paid $20,000 in Canada to kill a white bison. Well, now I'm angry again. Thanks, Falcon. Jesus Christ. respect for Falcon for being the ultimate at redirecting my fucking. Similarly, convincing arguments have been made concerning the limited. Welcome, Sean. Welcome back, comrade. We just got Sean. Okay, Sean. Did you miss this? Did you miss the part that I just read? Because that part was fucking crazy. Similarly, convincing arguments have been made concerning the limited forms of recognition and accommodation offered to indigenous communities by the state. For example, Taiyaki Alfred's work unpacks the ways in which the state's institutional and discursive fields within and against which indigenous demands for recognition are made, or adjuncted, can come to shape the self-understandings of indigenous claimants involved. Oh, damn. Thank you, Falcon. Very much appreciate the support, comrade. Alright. Members of the Juche gang, welcome in a new member of the Juche gang. And the Mi'kmaq Friendship Circle. Welcome, comrade. Thank you very much, Falcon. Appreciate that. The problem for Alfred is that these fields are by no means neutral. They are profoundly hierarchical, and as such have the ability to asymmetrically govern how indigenous subjects think and act, not only in relation to the recognition claim at hand, but also in relation to themselves, to others, and the land. This is what I take Alfred to mean when he suggests, echoing Fanon, that the dominance of the legal approach to self-determination has over time helped produce a class of aboriginal quote-unquote citizens, whose rights and identities have become defined more in relation to the colonial state and its legal apparatus than the history and traditions of indigenous nations themselves. The whole Juche gang is here. Similarly, strategies that have sought independence via capitalist economic development have already facilitated the creation of an emergent Aboriginal bourgeoisie whose thirst for profit has come to outweigh their ancestral obligations to the land and to others. And by the way, these are those individuals that the colonial state will exploit in order to legitimate their theft of actual collective indigenous lands, right? To further take lands from our nations, to further give lands to fucking big oil and the state itself, they use these Aboriginal bourgeoisie who they have been commonly referred to as compradors. But they use them and put them up as representatives of your nation, right? They'd be like, oh, this is so-and-so, the chief of this nation. Meanwhile, the actual people of the nation will recognize an entirely different chief, their hereditary chief. And then what you'll get a lot of times is this argument that hereditary chiefs aren't fucking democratic. When they are when they're more democratic than these chiefs that the fucking colonizers force on nations, right? And just because it is in practice passed down from one generation to the next, it is also within the power of the collective to remove that family as the hereditary chief, right? That's been the case for us anyway. I don't know how that works in every other nation, but for our nation, and I know many similar nations, it's like that. And that's what they end up doing. And that's one reason, I think, by the way, that got me first, like, okay, I want to know what actually is going on in DPRK, and I'm not going to listen to what some settlers tell me about it being a dynasty. Because, again, they do this with our hereditary chiefs here. saying that they're not fucking accountable or they're not democratic. So therefore, the settlers have to approve the chief, which is just fucking bullshit. That's not self-government. Yeah, they're at least chosen by the people based on our own traditions rather than a council educated by the invader. Exactly. And I mean, what business it, besides which, that actually, you walked me right to the point, John. Besides which, what business is it of the colonizers if it is a family that gets passed down that role? Or whether they're able to be removed by the fucking collective or not. What business is it of the colonizers? I mean, it's the same with DPRK for me. The fact that it's not, I will explain why it's not a dynasty, because it's just not a dynasty, and I like to be correct about as many things as I can be, and admit when I don't know something when I don't know something. But even if it was a dynasty, who the fuck is it for some colonizers or pro-imperialists to say how DPRK should organize their society? Just saying. Whatever the method, the point here is that these strategies threaten to erode the most egalitarian, non-authoritarian, and sustainable characteristics, traditional indigenous cultural practices, and forms of social organizations. All those ones I was just describing, actually. Yeah, there hasn't been a dynasty in Asia in literally centuries. Meanwhile, by the way, meanwhile, in the Anglo world, they have a king. In fact, here in Canada, Clanada, as I like to call it, we have a king as well. King fucking Charles. Like, what the fuck? Don't tell me about some dynasty somewhere else, you fucks. I know for the Hedgehog, they were hereditary. They were not hereditary at all, but they were referred that way by colonizers. They even gave one the anglicized name Half King. Jesus Christ. And I mean, like I was trying to explain, even for us, like what we term the hereditary chiefs really are accountable to the people, right? It's just not that they don't serve a 5-year fucking term like that. Like, I don't know. Self-recognition and anti-colonial empowerment. The argument sketched to this point is bleak in its implications. Indeed, left as it is, it would appear that recognition inevitably leads to subjugation, and as such, much of what indigenous peoples have sought over the last 40 years to secure their freedom has in practice cunningly assured the opposite. Interpreted this way, my line of argument appears to adhere to an outdated conception of power, one in which post-colonial critics, often reacting against the likes of Fanon and others, have worked so diligently to refute. The implication of this view is that indigenous subjects are always being interpolated by recognition, being constructed by colonial discourse, or being assimilated by colonial power structures. Thank you, Falcon. They were in office until people said get out. At least I get them out. Pronounced Hodino Shoni. Thank you. It's funny how when I look at the Iroquois language, it's extremely different from Mi'kmaq language, which again speaks to how angry it makes me when fucking Westerners try to like try to like make all the nations into one monolith. A lot of nations in North America seem to have had a mix of hereditary chiefs with a safety net of being able to remove an unjust leader from power easily. Exactly. It's like if the leader, the way like it was traditionally, from my understanding from elders here, it's like the way it was traditionally was if the leader wasn't like upholding his duty, their family would be, or sorry, if the leader was upholding his duty, his family would be passed on that duty. But if someone along his family line wasn't upholding that duty, they would be removed and someone new would take their place. Cherokee is part of the Iroquoian language family. Interesting. Mi'kmaq, we were part of the Wabanaki Confederacy, which is mostly, of course, on the East Coast. I think stretches down into Boston as well. Or whatever they call... What's that? What fucking... Boston's the city, right? What is the state that Boston's in? I don't know the states at all. The implication of this view is that indigenous subjects are always being interpolated by recognition, being constructed by colonial discourse, or being assimilated by colonial power structures. As a result, resistance to this totalizing power is often portrayed as an inherently reactionary zero-sum project. Oh, Massachusetts? That's the one that Boston's in? Okay. Interesting. See, I would never have known that. To the degree that Fanon can be implicated in espousing such a totalizing view of colonial power, it has been suggested that he was unable to escape the Manchian logic, so essential in propping up relations of colonial domination to begin with. I want to defend Fanon, at least partially, from the charge that he advocated such a devastating view of power. However, in order to assess the degree to which Fanon anticipates and accounts for this general line of criticism, we must unpack his theory of anti-colonial agency and empowerment. As argued throughout the preceding pages, Fanon did not attribute much emancipatory potential to Hegel's politics of recognition when applied to colonial situations. Yet, this is not to say that he rejected the recognition paradigm entirely. As we have seen, like Hegel, Taylor, Fanon ascribed to the notion that relations of recognition are constitutive of this subjectivity, and that, when unequal, they can foreclose the realization of human freedom. On the latter point, however, he was deeply skeptical as to whether the mutually envisioned by Hegel was achievable in the conditions indicative of contemporary colonialism. But if Fanon did not see freedom as naturally emanating from the slave being granted recognition from his or her master, where, if at all, did it originate? Morning, buddy. Please tell me DPRK figured out how to cure my hangover. Nah, damn, we can't have, sanctions. I mean, they did, probably, but the sanctions. Sorry. Yeah, we watched this. We watched this earlier. I was fucking laughing my ass off. I was laughing my ass off at that earlier. Where was it? I fucking... Oh, wait. Oh, no, wait. But if I go like this, will it start coming back up? Yeah, here it was. I recommend you all check this out. This is a really good thread. This is a really, really good thread about it right here. Because it's just like, here's the video, right? That the person, shocking video, shows South Africa's party singing, "Kill the Boers," quote unquote white, in brackets, whites. Kill the white farmer. This is all downstream from the rotten secular religion of wokeness and CRT plaguing America today. By the way, yeah.
Farmer, kill the poor.
We listened to Malma speak just the other day. Makes me feel so good. That's great. That is fucking great. And then it's just like he points out after what we read there. There's two very funny pieces of misinformation here. One, EFF is South Africa's Black Party. SA is 80% black. Pretty much all their parties are majority black. Two, this is downstream of American CRT and wokeness. Nelma is singing an anti-apartheid song. It predates CRT. Why would the white genocide alarmists lie about such basic facts? Because white genocide is a fascist myth. Whites in South Africa still own the majority of land and wealth through centuries of violence. Any push against this inequality will be labeled as genocide by fascists. Imperialism, the material base of white supremacist ideology, is dying, and inequalities will die with it. White supremacists like Benny and Elon portray whites as an oppressed group because they want to maintain the status quo where they're on top of the pyramid of humanity. And of course, Elon Musk could not help chiming in, but look who replied to him. Look who replied to Elon. Elon, they're openly pushing for genocide of white people in South Africa. Why do you say nothing, Cyril? They ask. And Malima fucking responds. That is fucking golden. You know you want to share this post. Ugh, I forgot to retweet it. Oh yeah, and then I did want to mention also, since we got a few more people in here now. Was it? Must be, I bet it's one more tab I have to open. Or actually, this one I know I did retweet. So, I want everybody who's on Twitter to please do your good comrade here a favor. And I want you to please share this post. Sorry, I just pasted that. I want you to share this post, please. And I request that you don't just share the post, but you quote share it and put in quotes this hashtag right here. Search the landfill. You want to help a comrade out today? I please recommend, I ask that you just take some time today in your Twitter to just retweet this and just put that hashtag there. And actually, you don't even have to retweet it. Even if you want to just make a post that just says hashtag search the landfill. Even that, it would be a huge help. So just like this. Because as you might, if you have probably heard, if you follow me long enough, you know there's missing and murdered Indigenous women. 3 of them recently murdered by a serial killer. Their bodies were dumped, police suspect, in a landfill. They searched a different landfill and found the body of a white woman who was killed, but they just literally flat out refused to search the landfill that they suspect the First Nations women to be in. So this is a call, a demand for those police to actually search that landfill so that the families can have closure. Yeah, I have seen quite a few of that too. But yeah, this is one you can share anything here by Terrell Tailfeathers. He's been posting about it almost non-stop. Highly recommend any of his if you want to share work, or just like I said, even if you just want to tweet and do that quote, that would be just awesome. Again, thank you in advance. Yeah, I'm gonna be singing "Kill the Boar" all night. In effect, Bannon claimed that the pathway to self-determination instead lay in the quasi-Nietzschean form of personal and collective self-affirmation. Rather than remaining dependent on the oppressors for their freedom and self-worth, Fanon recognized that the colonized must instead struggle to work through their alienation, subjection, against the objectifying gaze and assimilative allure of colonial recognition. According to Fanon, it is this self-initiated process that, quote, triggers a change of fundamental importance in the colonized psychoactive equilibrium, unquote. According to this view, the colonized must initiate the process of decolonization by first recognizing themselves as free, dignified, and distinct contributors of humanity. Oh my God, I love this because, I mean, this is... Wait a second now. I don't think there is for Blue Sky because, you know, there's not that many of us yet on there. But if you want to bring attention to it on Blue Sky, like, that would be awesome too, right? Any eyes on this helps. We had Mark Ruffalo, the Hulk actor guy, we had him retweet it. And it did go trending in Canada #1 at one point. So like we can get it there again, is my thinking. Is our hope. Now, I wanted to show you something here. Because just what we just read there, like... Hold on now. It was this one. Yeah, this one. So think about what we just read right now. And now look at this quote right here. I don't know either, to be honest, Sean. I mean, even if you don't use the hashtag, even just posting something is better than like hardly anything being on Blue Sky, right? I don't know if the hashtags work like that on there or not. It's socio-political integrity. It's man's most precious life. A noble life for him is to maintain and exalt socio-political integrity. Man receives socio-political integrity from the social collective. The social collective is the parent body of man's socio-political integrity. Therefore, the worth of man's life depends on how he is connected with the social collective. Man's life becomes noble when he is loved and trusted by the social collective. It is worthless when he is forsaken by it. Man enjoys the love and trust of the social collective when he considers the interests of the social collective to be dearer than those of individuals, and when he faithfully serves the social collective. In the final analysis, the great value and worth of man's life is to lead an independent and creative life, enjoying the love and trust of the social collective, while at the same time combining his own destiny with that of the social collective, and serving it heart and soul. This is the way for man to enhance his socio-political integrity and lead a worthy human life as a social being. Exactly, Kai. It's the opposite of alienation. I love it because it's like exactly what we're talking about here, and what Fanon was talking about, you know, is Juche was emerging really at the same time in Korea. If you want to understand that Juche is like a science, an analytical science, just look at how similar it is with other people who were scientifically analyzing the world around them, right? Unlike Nietzsche, however, Fanon equated this process of self-recognition with the praxis undertaken by the slave in Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, which Fanon saw as illustrating the necessity on the part of the oppressed to, quote, turn away, unquote, from the other-oriented master dependency, and to instead struggle for freedom on their own terms, in accordance with their own values. I would argue that this is why Fanon, though critical of the at times bourgeois and essential character of certain works within the Negritude tradition, nonetheless saw their project as necessary. Fanon was attuned to the ways in which the individual and collective revaluation of black culture and identity could serve as source of pride and empowerment, and if approached critically and directed appropriately, could help jolt the colonized into actional existence, as opposed to a reactional one, characterized by resentment. Yes, people are building a guillotine in the background. As Robert Young notes, in the context of third world decolonization, it was this initial process of collective self-affirmation that led many colonized populations to develop a distinctive post-colonial ethnology and ontology, unquote, which enabled them to begin which began to conceive of and construct alternatives to colonial project itself. Or some rich people getting composted. Oh yeah, no, that's just yeah, we're just no, wouldn't be anything like that happening here. No, that's in Minecraft, and we're power washing the deck. Yeah, that's it. We're power washing the deck. Not power washing bourgeois faces in Minecraft, I swear. you know, you understand. You know, we gotta remember, Jim from the Bureau is watching at all times. Yeah, power washing. We'll use that from now on. It's a leaf blower. No, it's a power washer. We're power washing bourgeois interests. I knew I recognized that fucker. Yeah, that's generally the ratio I assume, Kai, at any given time. I would argue that Fanon's call on black-skinned white masks for simultaneous turn inward and away from the master, far from espousing rigidly binaristic Manchian view of power relations, instead reflects on profound understanding of complexity invoked in contests over recognition in colonial and racialized environments. Agent Doug is watching, Agent Jim. I got a few agents, I'm sure. I have been defending DPRK for quite a number of years now. They tend not to like that. Not to mention when you're native and anti-colonial. They also hate that too. That's two, comrades. Unlike Hegel's life and death struggle between two opposing forces, Fanon added a multi-dimensional racial/cultural aspect to the dialectic, thereby underscoring the multifarious web of recognition relations that are at work in constructing identities and establishing or undermining the conditions necessary for human freedom and flourishing. Fanon showed that the power dynamics in which identities are formed and deformed were nothing like the hegemon-subaltern binary depicted by Hegel. In an anticipatory way, then, Fanon's insight... Fagel. Fuck, what the fuck? I was like reading here and here at the same time and mixed the two fucking names together. Jesus Christ, that was cursed. Fanon's insight can also be said to challenge the overtly negative and all-subjectifying view of interpolation that would plague Althusser's theory of ideology more than a decade later. For Althusser, the process of interpolation always took the form of a quote-unquote fundamental misrecognition that served to produce within individuals the quote specific characteristics and desires that commit them to the very actions that are required to them by their subordinate class position, unquote. Fanon's innovation was that he showed how similar recognitive process worked with call forth and empower individuals within communities of resistance. No, Bob, you'll convince them to stay longer. This is not to say, of course, that Fanon was unable to completely escape the Manchesium delirium that he was so astute at diagnosing. Those familiar with the legacy of Fanon's later work, for example, know that the actional existence that he saw self-recognition initiating in black-skinned white mass would, in The Wretched of the Earth, take the form of a direct and violent engagement with the colonial society and its institutional structure. At the very moment the colonized come to discover their humanity, wrote Fanon, they must, quote, begin to sharpen their weapons to secure its victory, unquote. You're paying attention, how can I pay attention? Well, now I'm all excited thinking about this. I'm waiting for a video now, is what's going on. In Fanon's later work, violence would come to serve as a, quote, kind of psychotherapy of the oppressed, offering a, quote, a primary form of agency through which the subject moves from non-being to being, from object to subject. Ooh, damn, Juche uses those same words again to describe how the masses, the toiling masses, the previously colonized masses go from being the object of politics to the subject of politics. In this sense, the practice of revolutionary violence, rather than the affirmative recognition of the other, offered the most effective means to transform the subjectivities of the colonized, as well as to topple the social structure that produced colonized subjects to begin with. Right, Sean? I was already stumbling over Look, I can't even talk right. I was already stumbling over my words hard enough. Now I'm talking like like I'm half drunk. Just derailing everything. I'm tongue-tied. Like blah 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 blah. Damn you, Bob! Okay, I'll forgive you because I like it. Turning our backs on colonial power. Mark? Gilles de Boer. For real, though. No, for real, I didn't understand that Juche was an analytical framework. I'm really enjoying learning. Good, I'm glad. I think again, to reiterate for the 19th time this stream, I think that's why it'll be good that we read Giving Priority to Ideological Work next. If we mix Fanon and Juche reads and Glenn Sean Couthard and other reads, I think you comrades will begin to see how Juche arose to analyze, like I always say. Marxist-Leninism arose to analyze the material objective conditions of revolution, whereas Juche arose to describe the social subjective conditions of revolution. And why was that the case? Well, because in a socialist society, the material factors become less and less important in determining the stage of revolution you're at. And what becomes more important is the stage of transformation that the masses are at. Which means, of course, how conscious are they of their own interests? How revolutionary conscious are they, as we put it? Yeah, I always got weird half answers over what Juche even was from everyone else. So before, most people explaining it were white. Yeah. And I mean, to be honest, most explanations I've ever heard of Juche hardly ever like get very far away from just the bourgeois quote unquote critiques of it, which are people that have never actually studied Juche for themselves. And in fact, if you all were to look up a Bill Bland article, like if you looked up Bill Bland criticism of Juche or something like that, then I think what you would find out is that most of these anti-Juche people are just parroting that article. Many of them without even reading it. It's just, it gets passed around until it becomes this background assumption, and they're just repeating it without even knowing where it comes from, right? Are there negative numbered stages? Because I feel we're in the negatives. I mean, the settlers are in the negatives until they get rid of that colonial. until you unite. Here's my take. The settler societies are in the negative until they unite behind the struggle of the fucking First Nations for liberation. And then you'll be in the positive, the progressive struggle for liberation at that moment. Right? Because I mean, like I said, what yeah, Zoop, what the fuck? That's not even an appropriate question. Like, don't no. That's a white ass comment. Yeah, my favorite part of Juche is how it's legally mandated that you can only have one haircut, and having that haircut is illegal, carrying the death penalty. Exactly. I get that you're giving around Zoop, but I don't like misogynistic joking personally. Just saying. It's something that rubs me the wrong way on this channel. Oh, we got someone who's banned in Sebsdev's channel trying to talk to me right now. Look, listen to what this joker's saying here in chat, comrades. I mean, but it is, whether you realize it or not, it does have a misogynistic origin. So I just got this random chatter here, everybody. Hegel was a right-winger. He was not... Why... Hegel was a right-winger. Was he not? Why are they talking about him in this? What the fuck? No, someone that chat can't see right now is trying to talk to us. Trying to tell us that Hegel is a right-winger or something. Like, having an American understanding of right and left wing is what happens when you come with that. No, not from YouTube chat. Falcon, do you see the person that is talking right now? Jared ban info restricted. Banned in Sebsdev, it tells us. And or to you it might look like they're just talking. It's this male rights _USA that's talking. Male rights, Bup is naked. And you like it. So correct me if I'm wrong in my understanding, but it seems like Juche is the framework that would deal with regeneration of preservation of culture, technology, and labor. Yeah, it's the thing that keeps society moving forward. No, you can't see that? I'm on mobile. I guess that's why. I thought your mod powers would allow you to see that. Oh, I know. Yeah, well... Oops. I don't know. Well, he's not in this chat, is he? Anyway, but yeah, that's a warning, Zoop, on that one joke. I get that to you it might not seem like it's misogynistic, but it is.
Yeah. See ya.
Yeah, he's a 20-year-old American, I wouldn't say with weird takes, just with typical reactionary takes. All right. Allow me to conclude the chapter now. Before concluding this chapter, I want to briefly address an important counterargument to the position I am advocating here, especially regarding the call to selectively, quote-unquote, turn away from engaging in discourses and structures of settler colonial power with the aim of transforming these sites from within. Dale Turner offers an argument in his book, This Is Not a Peace Pipe, towards a critical indigenous philosophy, in which he advances the claim that if indigenous people want the relationship between themselves and the Canadian state to be informed by their distinct worldviews, then, quote, they will have to engage the state's legal and political discourses in more effective ways, unquote. Underlying Turner's theoretical intervention is the assumption that colonial relations of power operate primarily by excluding the perceptives of indigenous peoples from the discursive and institutional sites that give their rights content. Assuming this is true, then, it would indeed appear that, quote, critically undermining colonialism, unquote, requires that indigenous people find a more effective ways of, quote, participating in Canadian legal political practices that determine the meaning of Aboriginal rights, unquote. For Turner, one of the preconditions for establishing a post-colonial relationship is the development of an intellectual community of indigenous word warriors, capable of engaging in legal and political discourses of the state. According to Turner, because it is unfortunate and unavoidable fact that the rights of indigenous peoples will, for the foreseeable future, be largely interpreted by non-indigenous judges and policymakers within non-indigenous institutions, it is imperative that indigenous communities develop the capacity to effectively interject our unique perspectives into the conceptual spaces where our rights are framed. It is on this last point that Turner claims to distinguish his approach from the work of indigenous intellectuals like Patricia Moncher and Tayaki Alfred. Turner claims that the problem with decolonial strategies developed by these scholars is that they fail to propose a means of effecting positive change within the very legal political structures that currently hold a monopoly the power to determine the scope and content of our rights. Yeah, Alfred actually, he wrote, he's going to be on Subversive in August? Awesome. He actually, this version that we're reading here, comrades, is actually had a foreword that was from him in here, which was actually really, really great foreword. Yeah, you might want to go back and listen to the foreword at the beginning, too. If you missed the first part of this, it was on... What day was it? What is today? Tuesday? So the last time we read this was Thursday. So if you go back to Thursday's VOD, before it's gone, I recommend you checking out the foreword from this. Make sure you remind me when that's going on, Falcon, because I would love to be there. Also, Anarchist Laboratory Sean mentioned something about coming on this show as a guest sometime. And I was mentioning that I think it would be probably a good idea or a fun episode or fun stream if we could have Anarchist Laboratory Sean, Red Falcon, and myself on here. And maybe Wasaya too or something. Get like a native panel going. North American native panel. According to Turner, by focusing too heavily on the tactics that would see us, quote unquote, turn our backs on the institutions of colonial power, these indigenous scholars do not provide the tools required to protect us against the unilateral construction of our rights by settler state institutions. For Turner, it is through the ethics of participation that indigenous people can better hope to, quote, shape the legal and political relationship so that it respects indigenous worldviews, unquote. But yeah, Alfred has some decent text and involving in restoring traditional governance on Canadian Mohawk territory. I'd like to read some more of his work as well. The efficacy of Turner's intervention rests on crucial theoretical assumptions reflected in the text's quasi-Foucauldian use of term discourse. I say quasi-Foucauldian because when it refers to the discursive practices of word warriors, he assumes that these pack the power, quote unquote, necessary to transform legal and political discourses of the state into something more amenable to indigenous languages of political thought. Here, Turner assumes that the counter discourses that word warriors interject into the field of Canadian law and politics have the capacity to shape and govern the ways in which Aboriginal rights are reasoned about and acted on. Welcome in, Dorian. The problem, however, is that Turner is less willing to attribute the same degree of power to the legal and political discourses of the state. This is what I mean when I claim that the use of the concept of quasi-Foucauldian. When Turner speaks of the legal and political discourses of the state, he spends little time discussing the assimilative power that these potentially hold in relation to the word warriors that are to engage them. Indeed, the only place he does briefly mention this is at the end of the final chapter when he writes, quote, "For indigenous person, the problem of assimilation is always close at hand. The anxiety by moving between intellectual cultures is real, and many indigenous intellectuals find it easier to become part of mainstream culture. This kind of assimilation will always exist. It may not always be a bad thing for indigenous peoples as a whole. It becomes dangerous when indigenous intellectuals become subsumed by dominated cultures, yet continue to act as if they were word warriors." Yeah. People do ignore how Foucault was part of that weird Euro left that was pro pedophilia. Yeah, they're. What the fuck is wrong with the Euros, by the way? Here we reach the limit in Turner's argument. There is little discussion of how indigenous peoples might curb the risk of interpolation as they seek to interpolate the much more powerful discursive economy of the Canadian legal and political system. I already read out Male Rights' message. Although Turner repeatedly suggests that part of the answer to this problem lies in the ability of word warriors to remain grounded in thought and practices of their communities, in the end, he spends little time discussing what this might entail in practice. Further, while Turner is right to pay attention to discursive forms of power, his analysis eclipses the role of non-discursive configurations play in reproducing colonial relations. My concern here is that the problem with the legal and political discourses of the state is not only that they enjoy hegemonic status vis-a-vis indigenous discourses, but that they are also backed by and hopelessly entwined with the economic, political, and military might of the state itself. This means the indigenous peoples must be able to account for these material relations as well, which would require an exploration of theories and practices that move beyond liberal and ideation forms of discursive transformation. While I recognize that this might be on the scope of Turner's investigation, I think that speaking on the diversity of forms of decolonial practice would have made his case more convincing. One of the important insights of Fanon's critique of the politics of recognition is that it provides us with theoretical tools that enable us to determine the relative transformality of certain fields of colonial power over others. These tools subsequently put us in a better position to critically assess which strategies hold the most promise and which others are most susceptible to failure. Conclusion. In retrospect, Fanon appears to have overstated the cleansing value he attributed to anti-colonial violence. Indeed, one could argue that many Algians have yet to fully recover from the legacy left from 8 years of carnage and brutality that constituted Algiers' War of Independence with France. Nor was the Front de Libération Nationale's FLN revolutionary seizure of the Algerian state apparatus enough to starve off what Fanon would call the curse of national independence. Namely, the subjection of the newly quote-unquote liberated people and territories to the tyranny of the market and post-independence class of bourgeois national elites. But if Fanon ultimately overstated violence's role in the perfect mediation, quote-unquote, through which the colonized come to liberate themselves from both the structural and psychoactive features of colonial domination that he identified so masterfully, then what is the relevance of his work here and now? In this chapter, I have suggested that Fanon's insights into the subjectifying nature of colonial recognition are as applicable today to the liberal politics of recognition as they were when he first formulated his critique of Hegel's master-slave relation. I have also suggested that Fanon's dual-structured conception of colonial power still captures the subtle and not so subtle ways in which the system of settler state domination that does not sustain itself exclusively by force is reproduced over time. As Tyke Alford argues, under these postmodern imperial conditions, quote, oppression has become increasingly invisible. It is no longer constituted in conventional terms of military occupation, onerous taxation burdens, blatant land thefts, etc., unquote, but rather through a, quote, fluid confluence of politics, economics, psychology, and culture, unquote. But if the dispersal of and effects of colonial and state power are now so diffuse, how is one to transform or resist them? Here, I believe that Fanon's work remains insightful. In that all-important footnote in Black Skin, White Mass, where Fanon claimed to show how the condition of the slave and phenomenology of spirit differed from those in the colonies, he suggested that Hegel provided a partial answer, that those struggling against colonialism must turn away from the colonial state and society, and instead find their own decolonial praxis, the source of their liberation. Today, this process will and must continue to involve some form of critical individual and collective self-recognition on part of indigenous societies. Not only in an instrumental sense like Fanon seemed to have envisioned it, but with an understanding that our cultural practices have much to offer regarding the establishment of relationships within and between peoples and the natural world built on principles of reciprocity and respectful coexistence. Also, the empowerment that is derived from this critically self-affirmative and self-transformative ethics of desubjectification must be cautiously directed away from the assimilative lore of statist politics of recognition, and instead be fashioned towards our own on-the-ground struggles for freedom. As the feminist, anti-racist theorist Bell Hooks explained, such a project would minimally require that we stop being so preoccupied with looking, quote, to the other for recognition, unquote, and instead we should be recognizing ourselves, then seeking to make contact with all those who engage us in a constructive manner. In my concluding chapter, I flesh out what such a politics might I look like in present. a politics that is less oriented around attaining a definitive form of affirmative recognition from settler state and society, and more about critically re-evaluating, reconstructing, and redeploying indigenous cultural forms in ways that seek to prefigure, alongside those with similar ethical commitments, radical alternatives to structural and psychoaffective facets of colonial domination discussed above. However, before I can commence with this concluding part of my project, Fanon's critique of recognition must first be evaluated against the politics of recognition as it has played out in the empirical context of Indigenous state relations in Canada. Providing such an evaluation will be my focus in the next 3 chapters. Here we go, Chapter 1. What do we think of Chapter 1? I know some of you might have missed the earlier part of that. I started a bit early today. But what do we think so far? You know what's funny? I want to find, there's another quote too. It's great what they say, the conclusion that he comes to also, like Falcon, doesn't it, that also remind you of Juche as well, you know, where Juche literally says, you know, the former communists in Korea were calling out, like, looking for recognition from the international or from the USSR, when instead they should have just been making revolution in their own way, by their own means, right? By dint of their own efforts. And this is like, it's a lot of like what this is kind of saying here. It's amazing how decolonial people had this deep understanding of also the social relations, the subjective factors that govern revolution, you know? And this is why I constantly stress to people that do not make the mistake of conflating historical materialism with dialectical materialism. You can... But don't conflate the two, okay? Because the problem with conflating, you lost me for a sec. Is it better now? But yeah, make sure you do not conflate historical materialism with the dialectical materialism. Because historical materialism is an analysis of social history using dialectical materialism. But itself is not the science that dialectical materialism is, okay? And the problem that we see that lost Westerners fall into with historical materialism is this mechanical interpretation, this deterministic, economic deterministic view that economy determines everything. And it's what originally led Marx to the wrong idea that revolution would first break out where capitalism is highly developed. So I'm going to read these 2 quotes here. Yeah, it's almost like we had a lot of this shit figured out already, huh, Sean? Even before Euros arrived, but you know, that's for another day. Perhaps that's something we can discuss when we get all 3 of us on here. And yeah, exactly, that's how we end up reductionists. So regarding what I just said about historical materialism, I want you to consider these 2 quotes. Although the founders of Marxism established the materialistic dialectical concept of social history by applying the general law of the development of the material world to social history, they themselves came across many problems in the practical social movement. Problems which could not be resolved only by the general law of the development of the material world. So they attempted to overcome the one-sidedness of the materialistic dialectical concept of social history by advancing some theories. For example, okay, is it any better now, Bup? Okay, give me one sec. How's that? Better? Okay, Falcon says he hears me fine. I don't know what's going on. Okay. Does it sound any better now? If it does, I will reread this quote. Okay. Okay, good. Allow me to reread this quote then. So, although the founders of Marxism established the materialistic dialectical concept of social history, and by the way, this is what we refer to as historical materialism, by applying the general law of the development of the material world to social history, they themselves came across many problems in the practical social movement. Sorry. And by the way, the reason they came, and for if you want an example of one of these problems they came across, again, the fact that they thought that revolution would first break out in the more highly advanced capitalist countries before the less developed ones, when in fact history showed just the opposite happened. So they attempted to overcome the one-sidedness of the materialistic dialectical concept of social history by advancing some theories. For example, that although social consciousness emerges as a reflection of the material and economic conditions, it reacts on these conditions, and that although politics is defined by the economy, it reacts on the economy. However, the Marxist materialistic concept of history is, in essence, a view on social history which considers the common character of the motion of nature and the social movement as the main factor. This theory was unable to avoid the limitation of identifying the process of social development with that of natural history. Fundamental difference between Juche philosophy and the preceding philosophy results in the final analysis from a different understanding of man. So then you might be asking yourself, well, what is the Juche analysis of social history? Well, it still uses dialectical materialism as its premise. But rather than just applying the general material laws of social history, the general laws of material development to social history, it instead uses dialectical materialism as a premise and instead has a human-centered approach to social history. And this is why instead of saying that class struggle or all hitherto class struggle is, the driving force of human development, which it only is in class societies, Juche says no, it's this drive for human independence, And independence means the overcoming of the things that fetter humanity, whether that's social practices or whether that's natural aspects in nature. Now, we try to make nature better serve us. We try to improve our ability not just to survive in nature, but to thrive in nature, which is a characteristic unique to us. And I want another one that I've read multiple times on this channel, but it's again saying the same thing. The Black Panther Party, and this is the one that surprises so many people, and I always like to drag this out to the people who claim like dogmatically that somehow Black Panther Party so broadening it from just working class to everyone. Yeah, I mean, yes, exactly, because the fact of the matter is the working class, their interests, their demands represent the broad interests of really everyone. And you know, even it's so revealing even in the terminology that Marxism uses itself, right? Like what Marx really discovered was that the masses themselves always trend towards building socialism. They trend towards communism, right? But what happens is you get this when class society breaks out, it's because there's this uneven distribution of resources. And then you have a certain group that can become interested in maintaining their like paradise position on earth, and thus preventing the masses from continuing to progress towards a communist society. And so these people instead want to stop history from happening. It's what Marx termed reactionaries, and that was literally his definition of reactionaries, was that they were opportunists who wanted to stop history from happening, because doing so would mean the progress towards better social relations, and that's the loss of their position as the ruling class. And yeah, Sean, and this part here, I love what you just said there, but in indigenous society, it's not just our survival and thriving, it's also animals, plants, and land. And this is the part, I think, where, yeah, Marxism, that's where Marxism falls short, and the neglect of the cultural aspects and reciprocal relations with the literal land we live on. And again, they take because just like you're saying, Sean, they take a very like economistic, like a very deterministic economic view of the world, right? And what they're missing out on, and even Marx itself, you can read Marxism itself, and it talks about how the material development, the material forces, the productive forces change humanity and alter our consciousness and all this, but it completely leaves out humanity's conscious role in actually struggling against the existing conditions, progressing society, and not only that, but humanity's transformative role in the world. And Juche recognizes that humans are the only being that can actually transform the world. That there is no other being that has the ability to transform the world. And what does this tell us? Well, if we have the ability to transform the world, then we have the responsibility to use that transformation to make a sustainable environment. And sustainable and servable to humanity also means that we have to preserve the diversity of nature around us, right? And that's something, again, it's amazing. This is why Juche like spoke to me as someone, you know, with a background in understanding First Nations teaching, is why Juche spoke to me in a way that that Marxism, Leninism alone didn't. And the fact that it came to me from a comrade in the Navajo Nation shows you like it's resonating with people in a way that Marxism, Leninism alone isn't, you know? Because I think it's more in line with traditional teachings. Not that Marxism is totally against those teachings, but just that it overlooks aspects that, you know, First Nations education taught us so many generations ago. It seems like Kim is saying here that it was too mechanical. Exactly. And not even that Marx itself is too mechanical, because it can be interpreted correctly, as we see with many countries. but rather that it can be interpreted mechanically, right? That it leaves open the opportunity to misinterpret Marxism in a mechanical way. And so all Juche analysis of social history does is seeking to close that, to remove the ability to misinterpret like this, to end debates, right? And Marx itself arose to end the debate between idealism and materialism, which came first. Independent consciousness that then all material coalesce from, or vice versa. And that's what it was about. Not about whether ideas can change society, which is what some people mistake idealism to mean. Because then they'll see Juche say something like, oh, human consciousness and people's ideology is the key factor in revolution. And then they mistake that as having something to do with idealism. Erroneously, because they're mistaking what idealism means. Oh shit, thank you so much, Red Falcon, for the gift sub for Zoop there. Very much appreciate that. Huge support from Red Falcon today, comrade. Very, very much appreciated. Okay, I'm going to leave you with this quote here today. Yeah, they're missing the cat icon, and this is... Wait, how many... That's your second month, so... Or wait, is that your second month, Zoop? Yeah, it is. So now Zoop, I know the founder icon is the most badass one, but you can also switch for a cat. And you'll notice as the months go on, your cat gets a more badass hat on each month. So your first month, it's got the old school World War I Red Army hat. And then next, your cat has what mine does, which is like the like winter style communist hat that you see often. Next, he'll have a Lenin pin on his shoulder, and then finally, he will have Stalin's hat. So that's yeah, Yushenka, that's it. So yeah, those are your cats that you have to look forward to. And then after that, we'll have to decide what to do with them beyond that. Because once I get to a certain point, I get to choose more sub badges. Okay, I'm gonna leave the stream off with two things. This is gonna be our next movie reminder that we're gonna watch on this channel. This will be Monday.
그건 날개가 있기 때문이란다.
나도 날개가 있으면 하늘을 날 수 있나?
그럼.
뛰어내리라.
떠서 다니지 말고 땅에 발붙이고 살아라. 노동자의 술 직전에 출연시킵시다.
아닙니다. 잠깐만.
너는 땅속에서나 하늘을 날아보겠다고?
누워서 침대 들면 제 얼굴에 떨어진다는 걸 알아요.
부처녀가 자꾸만 눈앞에 울거리는 게 미안하는 거 아니에요.
문찬진이 갔거든.
Yeah, I'm scared of heights, Sean. Very scared of heights. Funny story, I wasn't always scared of heights, but one time I actually accidentally got pulled off a building while I was working spray foam, and I have been terrified of heights ever since. I mean, I was always uneasy of them, but that just made it so much worse. I was spray foaming 15 stories up, they brought up this like the hose and the gun in this big crane, and I reached over to grab it, and the hose started unraveling, nearly pulled me off of this fucking balcony. Been terrified of heights ever since, like absolutely terrified to an extreme degree. Can I make custom icon for specific users? I do not think so. It's just it goes by whatever the sub month is. However, I do see that some channels have a specific sound effect. So like when a specific user comes in and chats for the first time, it plays this very specific sound depending on that user. That would be fun. Yeah, I felt like it, Sean, but I didn't. I worked for several years after struggling through that. And then I ended up on disability eventually.
The story of Dracula on the last voyage of the Demeter. Evil is on board.
Fuck, I was gonna say give my cat a Seneca Gusta what? I would love to. I thought about doing something like that. Some sort of Mi'kmaq headdress, but I'm not sure if I want to do that and have everybody have that.
Why did I make this?
By the way,
this horrible hike up an impossible mountain.
By the way, don't forget about our monthly challenge here.
Why did I
17 days left if you want to see me struggle through this awful game. Awful as in painful.
A game that was empowering, that would save your progress and inch you steadily forward. Since success is delicious, that would have been wise. Instead, I must confess, this isn't nice. It tastes of bitterness. It's capricious. It sets setbacks for the ambitious. It lacks lenience. It's bracing, inhumane. But not everyone's the same. I created this game for a certain kind of person. To hurt them.
So if you want to see me get hurt, comrades, you have 17 days left to get to that getting over a challenge to 100,000 labor vouchers. Right now it's at 65%. You get me there and I'll play this game for 2 hours on stream. And you can watch me suffer. And I'll even consider activating crowd control for it. Which would mean that you can then come in and spend your labor vouchers to make me suffer in the game even more. If you were around last weekend when I did crowd control Zelda, you'll know the fun that we can have with that. Alright, Falcon, we're gonna actually raid into I Dan Simpson here anyway, right now. I just want to leave you all with this other quote regarding historical materialism before we go. The Black Panther Party is a Marxist-Leninist party because we follow the dialectical method and we also integrate theory with practice. We are not mechanical Marxists, and we are not historical materialists. Some people think they are Marxists, when actually they are following the thoughts of Hegel. Some people think they are Marxist-Leninists, but they refuse to be creative, and are therefore tied to the past. They are tied to a rhetoric that does not apply to the present set of conditions. They are tied to a set of thoughts and approaches, dogma, what we call flunkyism. And just, oh yeah, don't misunderstand what we're saying here. Historical materialism is good, and it was an important weapon for overcoming all sorts of reactionary ideas. But what we shouldn't do is treat historical materialism like a dogma, right? Like it's the last analysis that could ever exist. Because what ends up happening when you do that is you then look at, for example, Juche's analysis of social history and go, oh, well, that's not historical materialism, so that must be wrong, right? And even Juche itself doesn't say that it rejects historical materialism, just that it realizes that there is certain limitations with historical materialism as an analysis of social history, and that we can always improve our analysis of social history by using dialectical materialism, which is that scientific method of developing our understanding. Like any historical condition can have one outcome. Like things are exactly. Because and we have to recognize that Marx, Engels, all of them, they only were working within the times that they lived, right? So they didn't have data for future societies. They didn't have data for things that were coming up in the future or for conditions in Canada and settler state colonialism, etc. They only knew what they lived through. And it's up to us to take their method and apply it creatively to our own conditions. So historical materialism is a fantastic, a great, important thing. Yes, it provided us an important weapon for overcoming reactionary ideas. But we should not mistake that as the last and final analysis of social history. And we should always seek to use dialectical materialism and creatively analyze our own history and our own theory. So just remember, if there's one thing to take with you from this message, it's that dialectical materialism is the science, while historical materialism is the application of that. And we can always improve our application of Marxism, right? By creatively adapting it to better suit our own conditions and the tastes of our own people. Thank you all so much, though, for joining me. We're going to raid into Dan Simpson. You know, fantastic friend of the channel, of course. Come join me on Thursday. I'm going to be streaming tomorrow. Tomorrow we're going to have, we're going to talk politics and stuff, but I'm probably going to do a lot of polls and let you comrades decide what we watch tomorrow. And then Thursday, we're back for some more theory. So come back and we'll be on to chapter 2 of this work here, Red Skin, White Masks, which will be For the Land, the Danae's Nation struggle for self-determination. I hope you all join me for that. Thank you all so very much for hanging out with me today. It was great. I hope we all learned something. I know I learned something. I said come. I did. And I hope you come again. I hope you come every time I stream. That's my hope to you. And I hope you take that message to heart, because I truly do mean that. You're all fantastic. Thank you, comrades. You made my day. As always, you made my day so much brighter. Thank you for hanging out with me. I'll be streaming again tomorrow, so come join me. Bye, comrades. Bye-bye, comrades. I love you all. In that way.